560 Srimad Bhagavad Gita, Chapter 4 are one and the same. Both of these are nothing but water. The sea and the waves are limited while the element, water, is unlimited. Therefore, he who sees water and both the sea and the waves, sees reality. As are the sea and its waves, so are the world and the body. As waves appear and disappear in the sea, so are bodies born and these perish, in the world. But, both of these have no independent existence of their own. Only God has independent existence. In God, there is neither world nor body. These seem to exist because of the existence of God. Both the body and the world, because of their affinity for nature, are limited, while God is limitless. He who, instead of seeing the world and bodies, perceives the Supreme Lord existing equally in all beings, notices reality. Gita 13:27. Appendix 5. Self-realization or destruction of ignorance takes place only once and forever. It means that there is no repetition of self-realization. The self once realized is realized forever. The reason is that when ignorance has no independent existence, then how will ignorance prevail? We are freed from ignorance because we are ever free from it, and the self is realized because it is ever realized. The self is existence and knowledge itself. By disregarding knowledge itself we have accepted the unreal, and by accepting the unreal, indiscrimination overwhelms. It means that turning away from knowledge itself we accept the existence of the unreal, and by accepting the existence of the unreal, discrimination is neglected. In fact, knowledge itself has not been disrespected, but its disregard has been from time immemorial. If we assume that we have disrespected knowledge, it shows that first we had knowledge. Therefore, if we respect it now, again it may be neglected. But the knowledge is attained only once and forever. After self-realization one is never deluded, because in fact delusion has no existence. Only the non-existent perishes and only the ever-existent is attained. The universe is within the sphere of the embodied self, and the embodied self is within the sphere of the Supreme Soul. Therefore a striver sees the universe in himself, Draksyasyatmani, and then he sees the self in God, Athomai. In Draksyasyatmani there is self-realization, Jnana viz, knowledge, and in Athomai there is God realization, Vijnana. In self-realization there is bliss of the self, while in God realization there is supreme bliss. By Karmaga and Jnanaga, the self is realized, and by Bhakti-yoga, God is realized. All is God, thus the knowledge of God in its entirety is God realization. In self-realization, salvation, there remains an iota of subtle ego, because of which there is difference of opinion among philosophers and in their philosophical thoughts. If there is no iota of subtle ego, then how can there be difference in philosophical opinions? But by God realization even an iota, trace, of subtle ego does not remain, and all the philosophical differences come to an end. It means that as long as there is a trinity, there are philosophical differences. But when Vasudeva Sarvam, all is God, is realized, all differences come to an end. Athomai expresses this God realization. In such realization no existence apart from God is intuited. Even if you are the most sinful of all sinners, you shall undoubtedly cross all sins by the boat of knowledge, wisdom, alone. 36. Comment. There are 3 categories of sinful persons: L. The sinful; 2. The more sinful; 3. The most sinful. The Lord uses the superlative degree to emphasize the fact that even the most sinful of all sinners can cross the ocean of sin by the boat of knowledge of the self. The Lord assures strivers that not only the strivers who are engaged in spiritual practice, having renounced sins, even those who have committed innumerable sins, need not lose heart, as far as attainment of salvation, God realization, is concerned. Even the most sinful person can attain salvation in this life, even immediately, if he resolves never to commit sin, but only to attain salvation or self-realization. The sins of such a person of firm resolve perish in no time. As darkness of hundreds of years disappears, as soon as a lamp is lit, it does not take time, so do sins disappear as soon as knowledge of the self is gained. The Lord uses the term it to clarify the point that generally sinners are not engaged in spiritual practice, but it does not mean that they cannot be engaged in it. If by coming into contact with a great soul, or by being influenced by an incident or circumstance or environment, etc., they resolve that they have to gain knowledge of the self, or God, they cross the ocean of sins by the boat of knowledge of the self. The Lord in the 30th and the 31st verses of the 9th chapter, declares, "Even if a man of most vile conduct worships me with exclusive devotion, he must be regarded as righteous, for he has rightly resolved and he attains to eternal peace very quickly." All the sins are incurred when a man assumes his affinity for nature and its evolute, the body and the world. When he gains knowledge of all the self, his affinity for them is totally renounced, and he gets rid of sins. When he gains knowledge of the self, it means that he acquired the boat of knowledge. Even the most sinful of all sinners crosses the ocean of sins by the boat of knowledge of the self. This boat is such as can neither be broken nor can a hole be made into it, nor be sunk. Through it, one can cross the ocean of sins. This boat of knowledge of the self can be gained through knowledge sacrifice. 433. Discrimination occupies an important place from the very beginning in the knowledge sacrifice and attains perfection in the knowledge of the self. When this perfection is attained, sins perish totally. Appendix. Here the Lord by the expression papabha sarvabha papakartama has mentioned the extreme limit of a sinner. Though the term papabha being used in plural number denotes all sinners, yet the Lord has used the term sarvabha with it. The term sarvabha also stands for all. Even by using these two terms the Lord has used the term papakartama in the superlative degree, which stands for the most sinful of all sinners. The term papakart is in the positive degree, then papakartara is in the comparative degree, and papakartama is in the superlative degree. It means that even the most sinful of all sinners can gain knowledge, wisdom. The reason is that the number of sins may be large but they are unreal, while knowledge, wisdom, is real. How can the unreal face the real? Sin is impure while knowledge is the purest among the pure. Gita 4:38. How can an impure thing suppress the pure thing? Therefore sins have no power to suppress knowledge. The main obstacle to the attainment of wisdom is attachment to the perishable pleasure. Gita 3:37-41. It is because of attachment to pleasure that a man has no relish for spirituality, and without the taste for spirituality, it seems very difficult to gain knowledge. As blazing fires bump fuel to ashes, 0 Arjuna, so does the fire of knowledge reduce all actions to ashes. 37. Comment in the preceding verse, the Lord declared, "You can cross the ocean of sins by the boat of the knowledge of the self." Now, the question arises, what will happen to the ocean of sins which still exists? The Lord clarifies the point by giving another illustration. He declares that the blazing fire reduces fuel to ashes, so does the fire of knowledge reduce all actions, sins, to ashes, i.e., all sins perish. As blazing fire reduces fuel to ashes, so does the fire of knowledge reduce the three kinds of actions, i.e., prarabdha, in the form of fate, saphisada, accumulated actions, and kriyamana, the present actions, to ashes. It means that when a man gains knowledge of the self, his affinity for the actions or the world is totally renounced. Consequently, the world loses its independent existence and there remains only God. In fact, all actions are performed by the modes of nature. Gita 13:29. But a man is bound by these when he thinks that he is a doer. And actions, such as circulation of blood, growth of the body, breathing and digestion etc., are performed by the modes of nature. So are eating, drinking, walking, sitting, seeing and speaking etc., undertaken. But when one holds that he is the doer of those actions, these bind him. A sense of doership changes activities into action, otherwise they are mere activities. By knowledge of the self, the stock of accumulated actions is totally destroyed, because all accumulated actions depend on ignorance. All present actions are destroyed, i.e., change into inaction, because one has no sense of doership, as they do not bear any fruit. As far as prarabdha actions, fate, are concerned, these produce favorable and unfavorable circumstances, but a man of knowledge is not in the least affected by them. He remains equanimous, without feeling sad or happy. Thus, when he has no affinity for actions, in the least, all his actions are reduced to ashes, i.e., and are changed into inaction. Middle. The Lord, in the first half of the next verse, reveals the glory of knowledge, while in the second half, he glorifies karmaga, the discipline of action. Verily, nothing purifies in this world like knowledge, jnana. He who has been perfected in yoga fully finds it automatically and positively in the self. 38 Comment here. The term Aya stands for the human world, because only human beings are qualified to gain purity. Such opportunities are not available in other species. All rights in other species are acquired through a human body only. The belief in the independent existence of the world, and the desire to derive pleasure out of it, give birth to all sins. Gita 3:37. By the knowledge of the self, when the world ceases to have its independent existence, all sins are totally destroyed and a man becomes completely pure. Therefore, in the world, there is no other means as capable of sanctifying as knowledge. The means, such as performance of sacrifice, charity, penance, adoration, vows, fasts, chanting the Lord's name, meditation, breath restraint, bath in sacred rivers, such as the Ganges, the Yamuna and the Godavari, destroy sins of a man and purify him. But none of these is as purifying as is knowledge of the self, because all of them are means, while knowledge is the end. God is the purest among the pure. Vishnu Sahasra 10. The knowledge of self, being conducive to the realization of God, who is the purest, most sacred, is very pure. Yoga Samsada, perfected in yoga, stands for the great soul who has attained perfection in karmaga. Such a great soul, in the 4th verse of the 6th chapter, has been called Yoga-yada, one who is enthroned or established in yoga. This state is the last stage of karmaga. When a striver attains this state, he realizes the self and his affinity for the world is totally renounced. In karmaga, the discipline of action, all actions are performed for the welfare of the world without any selfish motive and without a sense of doership. By doing so, a striver's affinity for the body and the world, which are revolutes of nature, is totally renounced. It means that in that case, the world has no independent existence, only actions are performed. This is known as perfection in yoga. When a man is attached to action, and its fruit, he does not realize yoga, i.e., union with God. In fact, a man has no affinity for actions and material objects, because he, the self, is eternal, while these are transitory, perishable. What can the eternal, imperishable, self, gain from perishable actions? The self can gain nothing by actions. This is called karma vijnana, science of action. Having realized this science of action, a man has no desire to reap the fruit of actions, in the form of pleasure etc., and then he realizes his natural and eternal union with God, which is called yoga vijnana, science of yoga. This is called perfection in yoga. States Revered Swami Ramsukhdasji, the knowledge of the self, which reduces all actions to ashes, and like which, there is no purifier in this world, is found in the self immediately, when the karmagi becomes perfect in yoga. In the 34th verse, the Lord said that a striver should go to a wise preceptor, who would instruct him in that knowledge. But by doing so, it is not necessary that he would gain knowledge of the self. But here, he declares that a karmagi, having become perfected in yoga, gains this knowledge. Assuredly, the term kalina, used in this verse, needs special attention. The Lord has used the third inflection, which means that through the discipline of action, one certainly gains knowledge of the self or realizes God. The term svayam shows that a karmagi gains the knowledge of the self, while performing his duty, without the guidance of a preceptor, or the scriptures or any other means. The expression Atmani Vindati means that a karmagi, in order to gain knowledge of the self, need not go anywhere else. When he becomes perfected in yoga, he finds this knowledge in the self. As the Lord pervades everywhere, he also pervades the self. But a person does not realize this fact, because of his inclination towards the world and disinclination for God. When he performs his duty scrupulously, for the welfare of others without any selfish motive, his affinity for the world is renounced, i.e., his identity with the body, sense of mayum and desire for the world perish, and he finds this knowledge in the self easily. The Lord in the term kalina instead of the second inflection kalam, third inflection has been used, which shows that the fruit will be surely reaped, i.e., through karmaga the striver will certainly find this knowledge in the self. Declares, he who is free from dualities, the pairs of opposites, is released easily from bondage. Gita 5:3. This knowledge of the self cannot be gained by the senses, mind, intellect and other means, instruments. One will FMD the knowledge of the self, in himself. The reason is, that the sentient self can't be known by the insentient senses, mind and intellect etc. The means such as, listening to Vedantic texts, cognition and constant and deep meditations etc., may help in removing the obstacles such as notion of impossibility of gaining knowledge and contrary sentiments etc., but they cannot induce a man to gain the knowledge of self. He can gain that knowledge by renouncing his affinity for the insentient, as the world can be seen with an eye but an eye cannot be seen by itself, but it can be said that the organ with which any object is seen is the eye. So it can be said that he who is the knower of all persons and objects etc., and by whom all objects etc. are known, is the self or God, who is not known by any means. Brihadaranyaka 2:414. An important fact: having studied the verses from the 33rd to the 37th, it seems that the Lord has glorified the discipline of knowledge, jnanaga. But if we give a serious thought to this, we come to know that the Lord says that knowledge of the self, which is so glorious and pure and for gaining which he is advising to go to preceptors, who are well versed in the scriptures, and can be easily and certainly gained through the discipline of action, karmaga. The Lord declares, he who is perfected in yoga, FMDs this knowledge of the self automatically, in himself, Gita 4:38. Thus, he has actually glorified the discipline of action. He means to say, that the knowledge of the self, which we can gain from wise preceptors through obeisance, questioning and service and by carrying out their directions, practicing cognition, and consent and deep meditation, can be gained also by performing one's duty of fighting. It is not certain whether he will gain the knowledge of the self from the preceptors, because they may themselves not have realized the truth. Besides, he may not have reverence for them. In this process, first he will see all beings in his self, and then in the Lord. Gita 4:35. Thus, in this process of gaining knowledge, there is possibility of doubt and delay. Therefore, the Lord exhorts Arjuna to follow the discipline of action, performance of duty, by which he will gain knowledge of the self, certainly and immediately. So, he does not want to preach him the common method of 8 inward spiritual means to gain knowledge. Lord Krishna himself is the Lord of all the great souls. So, how can he order Arjuna to go to the wise, who have realized the truth and learn knowledge from them? Further, in the 41st verse of this chapter, the Lord eulogizes the discipline of action, karmaga, and clearly orders Arjuna, in the 42nd verse, to fight by being fixed in equanimity. Appendix Pavitramya. Affinity for the world causes impurity on self-realization. When the universe totally ceases to be, then there is no question of the persistence of impurity. Therefore in the knowledge of the self, there is neither impurity nor inertness nor modifications. The term Maya stands for this world. It means that self-realization is worldly while God realization is unworldly. Link. The Lord, in the next verse, explains, who is eligible to attain that knowledge. He who has faith and is devoted to it, i.e., knowledge, and who controls his senses, gains knowledge, wisdom, and having gained knowledge he achieves the supreme peace in no time. 39. Comment in this verse, it is mentioned that a man who is full of faith gains knowledge. A man lacking faith may think that he has faith. So the Lord has used two adjectives, samyat and raya, who has subdued the senses, and tatpra, devoted, as the criteria of faith. The striver, who has subdued his senses, can be called devoted to knowledge. If senses have not been subdued, and these hanker after sensual pleasures, it means that the striver is not fully devoted to the knowledge of the self. The esteemed belief in God, saints, righteousness and scriptures, is called shraddha, faith. So long as a striver does not realize God, he should have as much faith in him as he has when he has seen something himself. God pervades everywhere, but he is not realized, because he believes that he is far away from him. When he thinks that he is in him, and his only aim is to realize him, he gains knowledge of the self or God. The world being ever-changing has no existence of its own, but it seems to exist because of the existence of God. When the striver has this faith, he gains knowledge of the self immediately. It is only because of his lack of faith that he does not gain this knowledge immediately. So long as senses are not subdued and a striver is not keen in his efforts his faith may be regarded as imperfect. If the senses are attracted towards their objects, there cannot be any concentration of effort that results in the dominance of something other than practice. Unless there is exclusive devotion to practice, faith cannot mature. Because of immature faith, only realization of the truth, self, is delayed. Otherwise there is not at all any cause for delay in realizing the self that is ever available and ever present. A person through obeisance, questioning and service should gain knowledge from wise preceptors, as mentioned in the 34th verse. But it is not certain that he will acquire it, because he can prostrate, question and serve the preceptor hypocritically, not from the heart. But here in this verse, it is mentioned that he gains knowledge, certainly because he has faith, which is a trait of the heart. Gita 17:3. When a striver has faith that he must gain knowledge of the self immediately, this is called Shraddha. God is ever existent and I am also existent and I want to realize God. Why then delay? Fully developed faith immediately leads to God realization. An important fact: how surprising it is that the changeful world attracts us, while the eternal Lord does not attract us. The reason is that we regard the transitory world as permanent, and want to derive permanent joy out of it, which is impossible. In fact, all the worldly objects, including the body, senses, mind etc., are perishing, decaying, while the self is eternal. Had the self not been eternal, who might have seen the changes? If a man, the self, had identity with the body, he, the self, would have also died with the death of a body. But it is not so. Thus, it is by error that he identifies the self with the body. Otherwise, the self is eternal, while the world, body, senses, mind etc., are transitory. Secondly, in this verse, the term labate has been used. It means the attainment of something which is eternal or whichever exists. A thing which has no pre-existence or which is created and compounded, its acquisition cannot be called labate. The reason is that the thing which did not exist in the past, and will not exist in future, only appears in the interim, is not but acquired. To regard acquisition of such a thing appearing in the interim, is a disrespect to discrimination. The self existed before the world was created, and it will exist after the destruction of the world. Actually, the world does not exist, it seems to exist. The unreal has no existence and the real never ceases to be. As soon as we realize this fact, it means that we have faith which will inspire us to gain knowledge of the self. The Lord, in the 3rd verse of the 9th chapter, declared, in the negative, those have no faith in this dharma, knowledge of the self, return to the world of death, without attaining me. The same fact has been mentioned here, in a positive form, when the Lord declares, he who has faith, attains to the supreme peace, i.e., is liberated from the cycle of birth and death. Why does a man not attain the supreme peace? The answer is that a man seeks the supreme peace in the perishable world, persons and objects etc., by having a disinclination for God. The supreme peace abides in all beings naturally, but because a person seeks it in the perishable world, he cannot attain it. When he gains knowledge of the self, his affinity for the world, which is an abode of sorrow, is totally renounced and he attains the supreme peace, which is axiomatic, natural. Appendixes: teamed belief, faith and discrimination are necessary for all the strivers. Yes, in Karmaga and Jnanaga there is predominance or discrimination, and in Bhakti Yoga there is predominance of belief faith. At first the self-realization is attainable. This faith a striver must have, then only he will strive for it. Link in the next verse, the Lord speaks ill of the person who lacks discrimination, who has no faith and who is of a doubtful disposition. One who is devoid of discriminative insight, and has no faith, who is of a skeptical nature, perishes. For the skeptic, there is neither this world nor the world beyond, nor any happiness anywhere. 40. Comment: the man whose discrimination is not aroused, or the man whose discrimination is aroused but he does not attach importance to it, and who lacks faith, such a man of doubting nature, perishes, i.e., is deprived of the spiritual path. Such a person of doubting nature uses neither his own discrimination, nor listens to the teachings of others. So, how could his doubts be removed and how can he progress spiritually? It is natural for a striver who follows the spiritual path to be confronted with doubts, because his knowledge is imperfect, This is known as ignorance. Therefore, the appearance of doubt is natural, and it is not very harmful. But it proves harmful when a person does not make effort to remove it, and he rather wants to maintain it. In such cases, the doubt becomes a principle for the person, and he holds that spiritual practice is nothing but hypocrisy. So, he ceases to believe in God and the scriptures etc., and becomes an atheist. Consequently, it leads to his downfall. Therefore, a striver should try to remove his doubt. By doing so, he will gain knowledge. It is characteristic of a striver to investigate and discover. Ajnana, ignorance, does not mean total absence of knowledge, but it means imperfect knowledge. A man, the self, being a fragment of God, can't lack knowledge, discrimination, totally. But he attaches importance to the unreal by regarding as real. Moreover, he has no disinclination for the unreal, even when he regards it as unreal. This is ignorance. If makes the right use of his knowledge, discrimination, his ignorance will perish and discrimination will be revealed, because ignorance has no independent existence. A striver should go on proceeding further to attain his aim. He should not be satisfied with what he has known. He should have a burning desire to remove his doubts and acquire knowledge. By adopting such an attitude, his doubts are removed by saints or scriptures or by other means. If there is no one to remove his doubts, it is removed by God's grace. An important fact: the soul is a fragment of God. Gita 1517. Therefore, when it has a desire to attain God, and feels sad and uneasy without attaining Him, he cannot tolerate his sadness, and he satisfies his desire. Similarly, when a striver gets uneasy or sad, in order to remove his doubts, the Lord Himself removes his doubts and frees him from the sadness. He has not to pray to Him even. An intense feeling of a person to have his doubt removed does reach God automatically. The Lord is a disinterested friend of all beings. Gita 5:29. So, He ever remains prepared to do away with restlessness, sadness and doubts of a man, somehow or the other. One commits an error, that having known a little he feels that he has attained perfect knowledge. This pride leads to his downfall. In this verse, there is description of such a man of suspicious nature, who is ignorant, i.e., who lacks discrimination, and who is faithless, i.e., does not follow the preaching of others. Such a man, of skeptical nature, perishes. For him, there is neither this world, nor the world beyond, nor any happiness. In practical life, a man of doubting nature behaves badly towards others, because he suspects their integrity and actions etc. He also cannot attain salvation, because it requires a determinate intellect, or firm resolve, and a man of doubting nature cannot resolve whether he should chant the Lord's name, study the scriptures, perform mundane actions, or attain God realization and so on. Because of his doubting nature, he cannot attain happiness or peace. Therefore, a striver through discrimination and faith must get rid of a doubt. When a striver comes across two contradictory statements, it leads to skepticism. Such skepticism can be removed, either by discrimination or through a reverential study of scriptures, or by following the advice of saints and holy men. Thus, if a skeptic is lacking in knowledge, he should acquire knowledge and wisdom. If he is wanting in faith, he should endeavor to gain faith. It is because without especially enhancing either of these two, his skepticism cannot be removed. Appendix: if a man has knowledge, his doubt is destroyed. Gita 4:41. Or if he has faith, then also his doubt can be wiped out. Gita 4:40. If there is lack of both knowledge and faith, then doubt cannot be slashed. Therefore the skeptic who is devoid of knowledge, discrimination, and has no faith, belief, viz., he who neither knows himself nor follows the instructions of others, the wise, has a downfall or is ruined. Link: the Lord, having started the topic of the discipline of knowledge in the 33rd verse, discussed the method of attaining knowledge and revealed its glory. Then, he declared, knowledge which can be gained through prostration and service etc. From the teacher, can be automatically gained by a man who has attained perfection in karmaga. After that he described the person who is eligible to attain this knowledge as also the person who is ineligible for it. Thus, he concluded the topic. Now the question arises, what should a karmagi do in order to attain perfection in yoga? The Lord answers the question in the next verse. He who has renounced all actions by yoga, whose doubts have been destroyed by knowledge and who takes shelter in yoga. Him actions do not bind. 0 Winner of wealth, Arjuna. 41 Comment All objects, such as body, senses, mind and the intellect etc., which seem ours, have been bestowed upon us, so that we may render service to others, with them, rather, than to lay a claim on these. Therefore, if these are utilized, in rendering service to others, by considering them as theirs, the flow of actions and objects is towards the world, and we realize equanimity, which is axiomatic. Thus, such a karmagi, who through equanimity has renounced his affinity for actions, is called yoga-sannyasta karma, one who has renounced actions by yoga. When a karmagi sees, inaction in action, and action in inaction, i.e., ever remains detached, during performance or non-performance of actions, he is really yoga-sannyasta karma. Generally, a man has doubts how he will be able to renounce his affinity for actions, while performing them, how he will attain salvation, if he does not work for himself, and so on. But when he knows the reality about actions, all his doubts are dispelled. He comes to know very well, that actions and their fruits are transitory, while the self, ever remains uniform. Therefore, actions have their affinity for the world, rather than for the self. In this way, when actions are performed with a selfish motive, a man is attached to these develops affinity for them. But, when they are performed for others, without any selfish motive, affinity for them is renounced. The reality about actions has been described from the 16th to the 32nd verses of this chapter. Out of them the 18th verse is an important one. It proves that performance of action for others, not for one's own self, leads to salvation. Atmavantama karmagi aims at self-realization. So, he ever remains self-possessed. All his actions, including eating, drinking, sleeping and sitting etc., are performed for others, the world, because ikshan shavan affinity for the world, not for the self. Na karmani nibadnanti. When a kanagi does not perform any action for himself, his affinity for actions is renounced and he gets liberated from the worldly bondage forever. Gita 4:23. In fact, it is not actions which lead to bondage, but it is desire for fruit, sense of mind, attachment and the sense of doership for actions, which lead one to bondage. Link in the preceding verse, the Lord declared, doubts are destroyed by knowledge, and affinity for actions is renounced by equanimity. Now in the next verse, he orders Arjuna to resort to yoga, having cut asunder his doubt. Therefore, having cut asunder, with the sword of knowledge, jnana, any doubt in thy heart, that is born of ignorance, while taking shelter in yoga and then stand up for the fight, O Bharata, Arjuna. 42. Continue the preceding verse, the Lord declared, he who has renounced affinity for all actions by yoga, equanimity, whose doubts have been dispelled by knowledge, and who is self-possessed, actions do not bind him, i.e., he is liberated from the bondage of birth and death. Therefore, he by using the term tasmat, therefore, inspires Arjuna to perform his duty. Arjuna had a doubt how the cruel deed of fighting would lead him to salvation. Moreover, he was in a dilemma, whether he should follow the discipline of action or that of knowledge. So the Lord advises him to remove his doubt, so that he may perform his duty scrupulously. A doubting soul can never perform his duty efficiently. The expression ajfayalnasarhutam, born of ignorance, means that all doubts are born out of ignorance, i.e., when a man does not understand the true nature of actions and yoga. Ignorance consists in regarding actions and objects as one's own and for one's own self. So long as there is ignorance, doubt resides in the heart, because actions and objects are perishable, while the self is imperishable. In the third chapter, emphasis has been laid on the performance, discharge, of duty, while in the fourth chapter, there is an emphasis on knowing the truth about karmaga. The reason is that action can be performed scrupulously only when reality is known about it. Moreover, if the truth about actions is known, such actions, which bind a man, can liberate him from bondage. Gita 4:16-32. Therefore, in this chapter, the Lord has laid special emphasis on knowing the truth about actions. In the preceding verse, also the Lord pointed out this fact, by the expression, whose doubts have been destroyed by knowledge. All the doubts of a man, who comes to know the skill of performance of actions, duties, are destroyed. This art of action consists in doing nothing for one's own self. Arjuna had sunk into the seat of his chariot, casting away his bow and arrow. Gita 147. He gave the Lord a flat denial by declaring that he would not fight. Gita 2:9. Here, the Lord directs Arjuna to stand up for a fight, having resorted to yoga. The same order was given to Arjuna in the 48th verse of the 2nd chapter, when he said, "Perform action, being steadfast in yoga." The term yoga stands for equanimity, evenness of mind. The Lord declares, evenness of mind is called yoga. Gita 2:48. Arjuna thought that sin would accrue to him by fighting. Gita 1:36-45. Therefore, Lord Krishna orders him to fight by having evenness of mind, thus he would not incur sin. Gita 2:38. In this way, we see that performance of duty by being equanimous is a means to be liberated from the bondage of actions. In the world, innumerable actions are performed, but we remain free from their bondage, because we have neither attachment nor aversion for them. It is because of attachment or aversion that we are linked with actions. When we become free from attachment and aversion, i.e., get established in equanimity, we are not connected with actions and thus become free from the bondage of actions. The self ever remains equanimous and uniform, while actions and their fruits always undergo changes. When actions are performed for others and objects are regarded as others and for them, affinity for actions and objects is totally renounced, and equanimity, which is axiomatic, is automatically realized. Starting with Tat, Sat, the names of the Lord, in the Upanishad of Bhagavad Gita, the knowledge of Brahma, the Supreme, the scripture of yoga, and the dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjuna. This is the fourth discourse, so designated the yoga of knowledge as well as the discipline of action and knowledge. This fourth chapter is designated as Jnana Karma Sannyasa Yoga, because in this chapter there is the description of Karmayoga, the discipline of action, and Sankhyoga, the discipline of knowledge, in order to attain the supreme knowledge, i.e., God realization. Words, letters and avaka in the fourth chapter. 1. In this chapter in Athakat Yurtadya there are 3 words, in Arjuna avaka etc. there are 6 words, in verses there are 511 words, and there are 13 concluding words. Thus the total number of the words is 533. 2. In this chapter in Athakat Yurtadya there are 7 letters, in Arjuna avaka etc. there are 20 letters, in verses there are 1344 letters, and there are 50 concluding letters. Thus the total number of the letters is 1421. Each of the verses of this chapter consists of 32 letters. 3. In this chapter Middle.Avaka, said, has been used 3 times, SSRL Bhagavan Avaka twice and Arjuna Avaka once. Meters used in the 4th chapter out of the 42 verses of this chapter, in the first quarter of the 31st and 38th verses, and in the third quarter of the 2nd, 10th, 13th and 40th verses. Nagana being used there is Navapula meter in the first quarter of the 6th verse. Ragana being used there is Ra.Vipula meter in the first quarter of the 24th verse and in the third quarter of the 30th verse. Bhagana being used there is Bhavipula meter. The remaining 33 verses possess the characteristics of right, Pathyavaktra, Anusdup meter. Sri Hari 5th chapter Introduction. Lord Krishna, in the 4th chapter, from the 33rd to the 37th verse, praised the tradition of going to teachers, who have realized the truth, having renounced actions and sense objects, and directed Arjuna to gain knowledge from them. Gita 4:34. In this process of self-realization, it is indispensable to meditate upon God in solitude by renouncing action. Arjuna did not want to fight, because he thought that he would incur sin by fighting. He wanted to attain salvation. So Arjuna thought that the Lord was asking him to gain knowledge by renouncing actions. Then the Lord, in the 38th verse of the 4th chapter, declared, "He who is perfect in yoga, gains it, knowledge, in the self." It means that the striver following the discipline of action need not go to the great persons who have realized truth, nor has he to practice any other spiritual discipline in order to gain knowledge. Thus Karmayoga, the discipline of action, as the means of self-realization has been commended here. Arjuna, in the 33rd verse of the 4th chapter, heard the glory of the customary method of gaining knowledge, and in the 34th verse by the term vidhi, he held it as the Lord's order for him to gain knowledge by that method. He heard the praise of karmaga, the discipline of action, in the 38th verse and the 41st verse. In the 42nd verse, he ordered him to perform his duty of fighting. Thus, having heard the glory of jnanaga and karmaga both, and also his order to gain knowledge and to perform one's duty, Arjuna could not decide which one of the two disciplines was better. Therefore, in order to get his doubt cleared by Lord Krishna, Arjuna puts a question. Arjuna said, "O Krishna, thou praisest the renunciation of actions externally, Sajjik Yoga, as well as their unselfish performance, Kanaga. Tell me, for certain, which one of the two is decidedly conducive to my good." Comment: Sanyusam Karmanam. Krishna Arjuna did not want to fight, because he did not want to kill his kinsman. In order to support his stand, Arjuna put forward several arguments, as in the first chapter. He said that fighting would incur sin. Gita 145. According to him, it was better to live in the world even by begging than to fight. 2:5. And he bluntly said to Krishna that he would not fight. 2:9. Generally, a listener interprets a preacher's word according to his own views. Having seen his kith and kin, Arjuna, out of delusion, thought it proper to abandon his duty of fighting. So, he interpreted the Lord's word according to his view, that he was praising the attainment of self-realization by renouncing actions. Punariyagam ca samzasi. The Lord, in the 38th verse of the 4th chapter, declared, "He who is perfected in yoga, fmds this knowledge, wisdom, of the self, certainly without the aid of any other spiritual discipline." Keeping this fact in mind, Arjuna says to the Lord that sometimes he praises the discipline of knowledge, 433, while at other time he commands the discipline of action, 441. This question was put by Arjuna in the 7th verse of the 2nd chapter also. In response, the Lord, having explained Kanaga, ordered Arjuna to perform action, being established in yoga, even-mindedness, in the 47th and 48th verses of the 2nd chapter. Again, in the 2nd verse of the 3rd chapter, Arjuna asked the Lord, "Tell me decisively, the one way by which I may attain to the highest good, bliss or salvation." In response, the Lord, in the 30th verse of the 3rd chapter, ordered him to fight, being free from desire, feeling of mindness and mental woe, grief, while, in the 35th verse he declared, "Better is one's own duty, though devoid of merit, than the duty of another well discharged." In this chapter also, the Lord clearly declares, the unselfish performance of action is better than the renunciation of action. 512. A karmagi is easily set free from bondage. 5.3. Renunciation is difficult to attain without yoga, karmaga, but a karmagi attains quickly the absolute. 5.6. Thus, the Lord explains to Arjuna that he should follow the discipline of action, by which he can attain to the absolute very quickly and easily. Arjuna was especially interested in attaining salvation. So, time and again, he asked Lord Krishna the way to attain salvation. 217.3251. A keen desire plays an important role in attaining salvation. Even without dispassion, a striver having a keen desire for salvation can follow the discipline of action in order to attain his aim of salvation. Arjuna was not totally dispassionate, but he had a keen desire to attain salvation, and so he was a deserving candidate. The 32nd verse of the 1st chapter and the 8th verse of the 2nd chapter reveal that, not to speak of the kingdom on earth, Arjuna does not even desire to attain an unrivaled sovereignty over the gods. But it does not mean that Arjuna had no desire to gain a kingdom and pleasures, because he said Sannyasiteos too that he longed neither for victory nor kingdom nor pleasures by slaying his kinsman. It means that he was prepared to gain victory or a kingdom without slaying his kinsman. Again, in the 6th verse of the 2nd chapter, he said, "We don't know whether we shall conquer them, or they will conquer us, and we do not want to live by slaying them." It means that if it was certain that they would conquer the enemy and if they could get the kingdom without slaying them, they were prepared to gain it. Further, in the 37th verse of the 2nd chapter, the Lord said to Arjuna that he would be benefited in either case. If he was killed, he would go to heaven, and if he became victorious, he would enjoy the earth. Had Arjuna no desire, in the least, to go to heaven and to enjoy the worldly pleasures, the Lord, perhaps, would not utter such words. It means that Arjuna could not cultivate real dispassion, but he had a desire to attain salvation, which is also clear in this verse. Link now. The Lord answers Arjuna's question. The blessed Lord said sannyasa, discipline of knowledge, and karmaga, discipline of action, both lead to salvation. But of the two, karmaga is superior to sankhya. To comment, according to the principle of the Lord, every person can follow the disciplines of action and knowledge, renunciation of actions, of whatever caste, order of life and sect etc. he may be, because his precept is not for the people of any particular caste, order of life or sect etc. In the first verse of this chapter, Arjuna called the customary method of gaining knowledge by approaching enlightened soul having renounced actions as karma sannyasa, renunciation of actions. But according to the Lord's precept, a person can gain knowledge by following the discipline of knowledge even without renouncing actions. Therefore, the Lord, supporting the customary principle of Arjuna, answers the question according to his own tenet. Sannyasa here, this term, sannyasa, stands for Sankhya Yoga, discipline of knowledge, rather than renunciation of actions. While answering Arjuna's question, the Lord discusses the path of Sankhya. In order to gain knowledge, through that Sankhya, every man, while performing his duty, according to his caste, order of life and sect etc., in every circumstance, can gain knowledge of the self, i.e., attain salvation. In the Sankhya discipline, there is prominence given to discrimination. This discipline cannot be successful without keen dispassion and discrimination. While following this discipline, a striver keeps his eye only on God, without accepting the independent existence of the world. So, the Lord declares, the goal of the unmanifested is hard to reach by the embodied being. Gita 12:5. In the 6th verse of this chapter, also the Lord declares that sannyasa is difficult to attain without kanaga, and karmaga is an easy means to get detached from the world. Karmaga, every human being has been attached to the performance of actions from time immemorial. In order to do away with this attachment, performance of action is indispensable. Gita 6:3. Karmaga is the art of performing actions. In order to get rid of this attachment in karmaga, discipline of action, every action, whether trivial or otherwise, is not to be taken note of, but it has to be performed for the welfare of others without any selfish motive, in order to get detached from it. So long as actions are performed with a desire for their reward, one remains attached to these. In response to Arjuna's question, which he put in the first verse, the Lord says that both Sankhya and Karmaga lead to salvation, because the same equanimity is attained through both of these. The same fact has been clarified in the 4th and the 5th verses of this chapter. It has also been pointed out by the Lord in the 24th verse of the 13th chapter, when he declares, some attain knowledge of the self by the path of knowledge, while others attain it by the path of action. Thus, both the paths of knowledge and action are independent paths to attain God. Gita 3:3. Sankhya is of two kinds. One has been described in the 34th verse of the 4th chapter, in which there is physical renunciation of actions, while the other has been described from the 11th to the 30th verses of the 2nd chapter, in which there is no renunciation of actions. Here the expression karmasannyasat stands for the two kinds of Sankhya. The Lord, in the 3rd verse, explains that a karmagi should be regarded as a perpetual sannyasi, with the spirit of renunciation, because he is easily released from worldly bondage. Again, in the 6th verse, he declares that renunciation is difficult to attain without karmaga, and a karmagi quickly attains to the absolute. It means that in Sankhya, discipline of knowledge, there is need of karmaga, while in karmaga, there is none for Sankhya. Thus, out of the two, which lead to salvation, the path of action has been declared to be superior by the Lord. A karmagi performs actions for the welfare of the world and also to set an example to the masses. Gita 3:20. Without any selfish motive. This sort of action is called a sacrifice in Gita. He who performs actions for himself is bound. Gita 3:9, 13. But a karmagi who works only for the welfare of the world without any selfish motive, is liberated from the bondage of all actions. Gita 4:23. Therefore, karmaga is better of the two. The path of action can be followed by all the people, of all castes, creeds and order of life etc., under all circumstances. But the karma sannyasa, renunciation, Arjuna talks about, can be followed only under special circumstances. Gita 4:34. Because all the people cannot come across such great men, who have realized the truth. Moreover, they cannot have full faith in those great souls and have an opportunity to live in their company. Thus karmaga is better of the two. Karmaga consists in making proper use of available circumstances, even savage deeds of fighting. No one is incapable and dependent on following this path of action, because in it, there is no desire to acquire anything. It is the desire which makes a man incapable and dependent. A sense of doership, and the desire to reap the fruit of actions, lead to bondage. A Sankhyogi and a Karmyogi both have to renounce their affinity for the world. A Sankhyogi roots out a sense of doership through dispassion and discrimination, while a Karmyogi discards it by performing actions for the welfare of others, without any desire for the fruit of actions. Thus, the former is liberated by renouncing a sense of doership, while the latter is liberated by renouncing desire to reap the fruit of action. If a striver renounces the sense of doership, his desire for the fruit of action is also renounced, and if he renounces the desire for the fruit of action, his sense of doership is renounced. A man has a sense of doership only when he has a desire to acquire something or the other. When actions are performed without desire for fruit, these change into an action. Thus a karmyogi is like as instrument, has no sense of doership. A striver tries to renounce his attachment to the worldly beings, objects and circumstances etc., because it leads him to bondage. In order to renounce it, he does not consider any being or object etc. as his own, nor does he do and desire anything for himself. All his actions are performed for the welfare of others, without any selfish motive. The desire for fruit of action causes a sense of doership and a sense of mine. If he has no desire for the fruit of action, his sense of doership comes to an end. It is not actions, but attachment to them and the desire for fruit, which lead to bondage. When one does not derive pleasure out of actions, nor does he desire fruit, how can a sense of doership remain? When he has no desire for the fruit of action, his sense of doership merges in the aim, God, for which action is performed, and then only God remains. The egoism of a karmyogi perishes quickly and easily, because he works for others. So his egoism is also absorbed in rendering service to others. But the egoism of a jnanyogi, he who follows the path of knowledge, continues to exist, as he holds that he is a mumuksu, seeker of salvation, and he works for his salvation. A karmyogi performs all activities for the good of others. Thus his ego subsides. On the other hand, a jnanyogi practices discipline for his well-being. His ego subsists as he practices discipline for himself. A prominent feature of the discipline of knowledge is the lack of independent existence of the world, while an important feature of the discipline of action is lack of attachment. A striver, following the discipline of knowledge, through discrimination, wants to hold that there is no independent existence of the world, but due to his attachment to the worldly objects, it is very difficult for him to hold this opinion in his practical life. But a striver, following the discipline of action, gets rid of his attachment automatically, as his aim is to render service to others, without any selfish motive. Moreover, it is easy for a karmyogi to renounce objects, as these will be utilized by others, while it is difficult for a jnanyogi to renounce them, by regarding these as transitory and elusive, unless his dispassion is very keen. Secondly, a jnanyogi easily abandons objects of inferior quality, but these of superior quality which he considers useful for him, cannot be easily abandoned. But a karmyogi may offer objects which are useful for him to others, easily, because he believes that these will be used by others. If there is an extra slice of bread in a plate, we try to put away the one which is stale, spoiled and dry, but if we want to give a slice to anyone, we will give a good one, so that it may be used by him. So, the discipline of knowledge is very difficult to practice, without renouncing attachment. It is because of attachment that Ijnanagi, being entangled in worldly pleasures, may have a fall. A man cannot renounce attachment merely by knowing the unreal as unreal. Though objects seen on a screen, in the cinema are unreal, yet a cinema-goer gets attached to the cinema and wastes his time, money, eyesight and character. It is attachment, rather than the object which bind a man. Thus, an object which may be either real or unreal, or it may transcend fate too, but it binds a man if he is attached to it. So a striver should try to root out this attachment. Appendix: though without yoga both karma and jnana lead to bondage, yet performance of actions does not lead to as much ruin as the bookish knowledge does. Mere bookish knowledge can lead to hells. Yogavasistha Sthiti 39. A man can renounce the unreal by regarding it as unreal by being established in the self. This establishment in the self does not depend on instruments such as the mind and intellect etc., because they themselves are unreal. How can we get rid of the unreal? Will your affinity of the unreal subsists and we depend upon it for realizing the real? He who preaches the gospel all as Brahma to an ignorant man, condemns that man to the snare of fightful hells. Therefore the man who perform actions is superior to the man possessing bookish knowledge. Then what can be said about the superiority of the person who follows the discipline of action? A Jnanagi is useful only for himself, but a Kanagi is useful for the entire universe. He who is useful for the universe is also useful for himself. This is the rule. Therefore a Karmagi is superior to a Jnanagi. The discipline of action can be practiced without the discipline of knowledge, but the discipline of knowledge is difficult to attain without the discipline of action. Gita 5:6. Therefore Kanaga is superior to Sankhyaga. Discipline of devotion is superior to discipline of action. Therefore in the Gita there is description first of Sankhyaga, then of Karmaga and afterwards of Bhakti-yoga. In this order the yogas have been discussed. Kanaga and Jnanaga both bear the same fruit. Gita 5:4-5. In their practices Kanaga and Bhakti-yoga are one major. Karuna eva ca. Gita 12:13. Because Karmaga and Bhakti-yoga in both, feeling of providing happiness to others reigns. In the performance of actions Karmi, one who perform actions, and Kanagi, who without attachment acts for the welfare of others, are one. Gita 3:25. And in the performance of actions, an enlightened soul and God are similar. 1. Gita 3:22-26. In this way a Kanagi becomes one with a Karmi. The same order has been followed in the Bhagavata, Srimad 11,126. I have mentioned 3 yogas for the men who want to attain salvation: Jnanaga, Karmaga, and Bhakti-yoga. Besides these 3 there is no other way for salvation. A Jnanagi, a Bhakti-yogi and God, all the 4. This is the special characteristic of Kanaga. In Sphuik yoga a subtle trace of ego may persist, but in Kanaga, because of the total detachment from actions and objects, no subtle trace of ego subsists. In Kanaga, a Kana remains. Gita 4:18, while in Sankhyaga the soul, self, remains. Gita 6:29. Link now, the Lord in the next verse, explains why Karmaga is better of the 2. He who neither hates nor desires anything should be known as a nidya-sannyasi, ever a renouncer, for, free from dualities, pairs of opposites, he is liberated easily from bondage. 0. Mighty armed, Arjuna. 3. Comment: Mahabaho. The term Mahabaho stands for one who is mighty armed, i.e., brave, and also for one whose brothers and friends are great men. Arjuna's friend was Lord Krishna, the disinterested friend of all beings, and his brother was Yudhisthira, the most righteous person, who had no enemy. By addressing Arjuna as Mahabaho, the Lord means to say that he possesses the might to follow the path of action easily. A Karmagi does not hate any being, object, circumstance or principle etc., but he renders selfless service to everyone. If he has the least hatred for anyone, he cannot follow the discipline of action scrupulously. He should give priority, in rendering service, to a person for whom he bears even a little malice. The Lord, by using the expression nadvasti, first of all, wants to impress that he who deems someone as bad and wants to harm him, cannot grasp the secret of Karmaga. A vital fact for a Karmagi: it is more significant to renounce evil, rather than to do good, for the welfare of others. Actions and objects are limited and, Therefore, only limited service can be rendered with such resources. But, when a man renounces evil, his unlimited inward feeling is prominent. Secondly, by doing good to others, a person cultivates notion of pride, which is the root of all demoniac traits. Where there is imperfection, there is pride. On the contrary, where there is perfection, pride is out of the question. If a serious thought is given, it becomes clear that no good can be done without the help of perishable objects. In fact, those perishable objects are not ours, but they are of those whose service is rendered with them. Then, if a man is proud of doing good, it is attachment to the perishable. So long as a man is attached to the perishable, he cannot attain yoga. The pride of doing good is more disastrous than other evils, because it settles in the sense of ness. Actions and their fruits disappear, but pride settled in the sense of ness never disappears. Secondly, an evil as an evil can be easily renounced. But when an evil disguises itself as a virtue, it is difficult to renounce it. In the same way, we can easily discard iron handcuffs, but we find it difficult to discard gold ones, because they look like ornaments. When evil is renounced by a man, good to the entire world is automatically done by him. A person, free from evil, does good to the entire universe, even while leading a secluded life in a Himalayan cave. Renunciation of desire is very important in karmaga. A karmagi does not desire any being or object or circumstance. Renunciation of desire is very much connected with the welfare of others. By rendering service to others, we get the required strength to give up desire. In karmaga, it is a doer who is desireless, not action. Being inert, actions are not desireless or otherwise. All actions are dependent on the doer. A doer being desireless, his actions are called desireless. Those actions, without expectation of fruit, are called karmaga. Karmaga and niskamacana both are synonyms. Karmaga is never sakama, with a selfish motive. The desireless doer remains detached from the fruit of action. When actions are performed without any selfish motive, it is called karmaga. When actions are performed in this way, the doer becomes detached from the fruit of actions. But, when he performs actions by being attached to fruit of actions, he is bound. Gita 5:12. When all actions are performed for the welfare of others, without any selfish motive, a striver is easily set free from bondage. Therefore a doer should ever remain desireless. The more selfless he is, the more efficient the practice of the discipline. On being totally desireless, the karmagi reaches consummation. Arjuna thought it better to live in the world even by begging, than to fight. Gita 2:5. So in response to his statement, the Lord seems to clarify that such renunciation apprehending the death of teachers is external, outwardly, but real renunciation consists in being free from attachment and aversion, while performing action. Further, in the first verse of the 6th chapter also, the Lord declares, "He who does not light the sacred fire is not a sannyasi." It means that a person who renounces all actions, such as sacrificial fire etc., is not a sannyasi. Sannyasa, renunciation, is an inward attitude, by which a karmagi renounces his dependence on the world. Such a karmagi is a real sannyasi, renouncer. Sannyasa, renunciation, consists in the performance of actions without being attached to them in any way. A striver, who has no affinity for actions, has never to reap its fruit. Gita 18:12. Therefore, a karmagi, while performing actions sanctioned by the scriptures, is ever a sannyasi, renouncer. It is difficult to follow the discipline of knowledge without following the discipline of action. Therefore, a striver who follows the discipline of knowledge is first a karmagi and then a sannyasi, sankyagi. But, for a karmagi it is not necessary to follow the discipline of knowledge. So, a karmagi is a sannyasi, renouncer, from the very beginning. He who has renounced attachment and aversion need not go to the renounced order. When a striver resolves that any person, object, senses, mind and intellect are neither his nor for him and he has neither attachment nor aversion for them, he is ever a renouncer. A karmagal. While performing either mundane or spiritual actions, ever remains detached. This detachment is real renunciation. Therefore, he should be known as one who has ever the spirit of renunciation. At the beginning of the spiritual discipline, a striver has opposite experiences in the form of attachment and aversion. He, through good company, study of scriptures and discrimination, decides on God realization as his aim, but his so-called mind and senses, etc., are naturally inclined towards pleasure and prosperity. Thus, sometimes he wants to attain God, while at other times, he hankers after worldly pleasures and prosperity. His inclination changes. There is description of this sort of release from bondage in the Gita in the following expression: shall cast off bondage of action. 239, protects one from great fear. 240, one casts off in this life both good and evil deeds. 250, shall be liberated from the evil. 416, 91, shall cross all sins. Having attained me, these great souls don't take birth here, which is the place of pain and which is non-eternal. 928, and I straightway deliver from the ocean of death-bound existence, and so on, according to the company he keeps. But he cannot enjoy the worldly pleasures undisturbed, because the latent impressions of good company etc. cause dispassion, disinclination for pleasures, in his mind. Thus, there is a duel between pleasure and spiritual practice. Egoism hinges on this duel. When a striver has a determinate intellect, only to realize God, rather than to hanker after worldly pleasures and prosperity, this duel comes to an end and his egoism merges in God. There is a struggle between the pairs of opposites, so long as a man derives pleasures out of the persons and objects etc. This inclination for pleasure does not let the determination for God realization become firm. So there is a struggle. When a striver has a determinate intellect, that he has to work for the welfare of others without hankering after worldly pleasures, he becomes free from the pairs of opposites. By the expression nadvsti nakanksati, the Lord advises strivers that they should be free from antithetical feelings. Hate, aversion, and desire, attachment, are stumbling blocks to God's realization. A man has to reap the fruit of his past actions, in the form of desirable and undesirable circumstances, whether he desires them or not. But, it is an error, that he is attached to desirable circumstances and has aversion for the undesirable ones. As soon as this error is rectified through discrimination, he becomes free from attachment and aversion. Secondly, the self always exists independently, without the help of objects, persons and actions etc. A man, the self, the soul, has its existence during sound sleep, also when he is oblivious of the entire world. In the wakeful and dreamy states, he can exist, even without any being and object. So, why should he have attachment or aversion for them? By thinking so, attachment and aversion come to an end. Attachment and aversion are perishable, but a person being attached to persons and objects etc., wants to maintain these. As far as desire for God realization is concerned, it ever remains uniform, because the self is a fragment of God. But the desire seems to increase and decrease, because of his less and more attachment for the world, respectively. His desire to live, to know and to be happy, is in fact, the desire to attain the truth, knowledge and bliss, i.e., God. This desire constantly prevails in the human being. When attachment to the world is renounced and there is only one desire for God realization, he becomes free from the pair of opposites. A striver, following any one of the three paths of action, of knowledge or of devotion, must be free from the pairs of opposites. So long as there is delusion of the pairs of opposites, a man is not liberated from bondage. Gita 7:27. Attachment and aversion are enemies which are the stumbling blocks to God realization. Gita 3:34. When a striver becomes free from dualities, pairs of opposites, attachment and aversion perish, and then he attains God easily. It is because of attachment and aversion that a man gets entangled in the worldly snare. All spiritual disciplines are practiced in order to wipe out attachment and aversion. When attachment and aversion are wiped out, the ever-present Lord is naturally attained without effort. The reason is that he is not realized through unreal, but is realized by renouncing the unreal. The unreal world seems to exist because of attachment and aversion. It automatically goes into extinction. So, if a striver is neither attached nor has an aversion for the perishable world, he will naturally attain salvation. will be released from bondage, upon equanimity in favorable and unfavorable circumstances, and freedom from the feeling of pleasure and pain is to be nirvana, viz., free from dualities, pairs of opposites. The only desired aim of all spiritual practices of yogis is to get rid of attachment to the entire world. Srimad Bhagavata 3:32-27. In identification of the self with the non-self, if there is predominance of the sentient, there is eagerness, curiosity, and if there is predominance of the insentient, there is desire. A man has the real hunger for the imperishable divinity, but he has the relish for the perishable because he wants to satisfy the hunger of the imperishable by the perishable. This duality between hunger and relish strengthens a man's worldly bondage. When his attachment and aversion to the world are wiped out, then his thirst for self-realization is fulfilled and his desire is wiped out, and he becomes free from dualities, pairs of opposites. Links S. In the first half of the second verse of this chapter, the Lord declared, disciplines of knowledge and action both lead to salvation. The Lord explains the same point in the next two verses. The ignorant, not the wise, speak of the discipline of knowledge, satyoga, and discipline of action, karmaga, as different. He who is well established in one, gets the fruit of both. 4. Comment Arjuna, in the first verse of this chapter, called the method of gaining knowledge from the wise who have realized the truth, having renounced actions, as karma sannyasa. In the second verse, the Lord, attaching importance to his principle, called it sannyasa and karma sannyasa. Now, the Lord calls it sakhya. By sakhya, he means establishment in the self by discriminating the self from the body. According to him, sannyasa and sakhya are synonyms, in which there is no need of renouncing actions physically. What Arjuna calls karma sannyasa is undoubtedly a kind of sakhya mentioned by the Lord, because after receiving instruction from a preceptor, a striver comes to know reality about the body and the soul. The Lord, by the term bhayal, means to convey that those who say that sakhya, discipline of knowledge, and karmaga, discipline of action, produce different results, are children, viz., and ignorant, even though they may be aged and intellectual. But the wise say that both of these produce the same result, though they may be different, as means. The Lord himself, in the third verse of the third chapter, declared the twofold path, the path of knowledge and that of action, different as means, but the goal is one. In the Gita, time and again, it has been pointed out that the result of the practice of sankhyoga, discipline of knowledge, and that of karmaga, discipline of action, is the same. In the 24th verse of the 13th chapter, the Lord declares that the self or God can be perceived, both through the path of knowledge and that of action. In the 19th verse of the 3rd chapter, it has been mentioned that a man reaches the Supreme through the discipline of action, while in the 4th verse of the 12th chapter and the 34th verse of the 13th chapter, it has been mentioned that strivers reach the Supreme by following the discipline of knowledge. Thus, according to the Lord, both of the paths lead to the same destination. Appendix: he who knows the scriptural topics but does not know the reality about Sankhyoga and Karmaga deeply, is indeed a child, viz., is ignorant. In whole of the Gita, the term phala, fruit, for the imperishable reality has been used only in this verse. The term phala means result. Karmaga and Jnanaga s. The Lord's purpose in calling the reality attained by these two disciplines as phala is that in these two disciplines, a man's effort is important. In Jnanaga, effort in the form of discrimination is important, and in Karmaga, effort in the form of action for the welfare of others, is important. A striver's own effort, labor, proves fruitful, so it has been called phala, fruit. This fruit is not perishable. Kanaga and Jnanaga, both of them bear fruit in the form of self-realization or attainment of the absolute. Performance of duty is Karmaga and inclination to do nothing is Jnanaga. The reality which is attained by doing nothing, is attained by discharging one's duty. Performance, to do, and non-performance, not to do, are the means, spiritual disciplines, and the reality which is attained by these means is the end, goal. The supreme state, which is attained by the Sphuric yogi, is also reached by the Karmagi. He who sees that the ways, as a result, of Sankhyoga and Karmaga are one, perceives the reality. 5. Comment in the second half of the preceding verse, the Lord declared, he who is well established in Sankhyoga or Karmaga, performance of action, gets the fruit of both, i.e., attains God realization. The same fact is being pointed out by the Lord here, in this verse, by declaring that the state which is attained by a Sankhyogi is also attained by a Karmyogi. The Lord uses the term API also here to remove the doubt off those people who think that God can be realized only by the discipline of knowledge, rather than by the discipline of action. A striver, through both the disciplines, has to renounce his affinity for actions, i.e., for active prakriti, nature. A Karmyogi, in order to distinguish the sentient from the insentient, has to use the discrimination of Ajnanayogi, even during spiritual practice. Similarly, Ajnanayogi, Sankhyogi, has to adopt the method of Karmyoga, of not performing action for himself. A Sankhyogi's discrimination is to be utilized to distinguish the soul from the body, world, and the actions of a Karmyogi are performed in order to render service to the world. When two strivers, one following the path of Sankhyoga and the other of Karmyoga, attain perfection, both of them reach the same destination, i.e., have liberation. Gita 3:3. The world is uneven. The closest worldly relationship is not free from this unevenness, while the Lord is even and uniform. So, he can be realized by renouncing affinity for the world. There are two paths of knowledge and of action available to renounce this affinity. Jnanayoga, the discipline of knowledge, consists in thinking that the real self lacks nothing, and so there is no question of any desire or attachment in the real self. By thinking so, a striver gets detached. In Karmyoga, a striver renders service to others, with those objects he is attached to and to those persons he is attached to, without any selfish motive. Thus in the discipline of knowledge, through discrimination, while in the discipline of action through service, affinity for the world is renounced. In the first half of the preceding verse, the Lord declared by negative inference, the ignorant, not the wise, speak of the Sankhyoga and the Karmyoga as different. The same fact is being pointed out here by positive inference when the Lord declares, he who sees that the ways, as a result, of Sankhyoga and Karmyoga, are one, he sees, truly. Thus the gist of the fourth and the fifth verses is that the Lord regards both the disciplines of knowledge and action as independent spiritual disciplines, and the fruit of both is God realization. Those who do not know this reality are called ignorant, while those who know this reality are designated wise by the Lord. An important fact: when a striver attains perfection in any one of the spiritual disciplines, he has neither a desire to live, nor fear of death, nor a desire to acquire anything, or do anything. A perishable body need not be afraid of death, because it is decaying all the time, while the self need not have a desire to live, because it is eternal. Then, who is afraid of death and who has a desire to live? The answer is, that when the self identifies itself with the body, it is afraid of death and it has a desire to live. Both of these, the desire to live and the fear of death, can be wiped out by the discipline of knowledge, discrimination. The self lacks nothing, therefore, it has no desire to acquire anything, and so no desire to do any work. But when it identifies itself with a body, it feels the lack. Then, it has a desire to acquire something or the other, and in order to acquire that, it has to act. The desire to acquire and to act perishes through Karmyoga. When either the discipline of knowledge or the discipline of action attains perfection, the desires to live, to acquire and to act, and the fear of death, totally perish. Appendix: Sankhyoga and Karmyoga, both disciplines being worldly, are one and the same. In Sankhyoga, striver gets established in the self, and being established in the self, matter, non-self, is renounced. In Karmyoga, striver renounces matter, and having renounced matter, non-self, he gets established in the self. In this way the result of both Sankhyoga and Karmyoga is attainment of divinity, pure consciousness, viz., self-realization. To apply the body in the service of the world is Karmyoga, and to detach the self from the body is Jnanayoga. Either apply the body in the service of the world or get the self detached from the body. Both will bear the same fruit, viz., by both these disciplines, having renounced affinity for the world, one will get established in the self. Here in the 4th and 5th verses, the first half of the 4th verse has connection with the second half of the 5th verse, and the first half of the 5th verse has connection with the second half of the 4th verse. Karmaga, Jnanaga and Bhaktiyoga. Out of these three disciplines, Jnanaga and Bhaktiyoga are more popular, but there is less popularity of Karmaga. The Lord in the Gita also declares, this Karmaga through long lapse of time is lost to the world. Gita 4:2. Therefore about Karmaga, there is a general belief that this is not an independent means of God realization, and so a striver following the discipline of action afterwards either follows Jnanaga or Bhaktiyoga stavat karmani kurvitana nirvadyate yavadamakatha vanajyate. Srimadbha, a person should perform actions by the time till he develops this passion for pleasures, he becomes eligible for Jnanaga, or he develops faith in listening to my pastime and life story, he becomes qualified for Bhaktiyoga. But here the Lord declares that just like Jnanaga, Karmaga is also an independent discipline for God realization. Besides these 4th and 5th verses and several other verses, also the Lord has mentioned that Karmaga is an independent means to attain self-realization or the supreme peace or salvation or God realization. As in Srimad Bhagavata, also Jnanaga has been mentioned as an independent means for God realization. He, who being situated in his own dharma, duty, and renouncing the desire for pleasure, worships God by the performance of his duty and does not do any action with an interested motive, has not to go to heaven or hell, viz., he is freed from the bondage of actions. The Karmagi being situated in his own dharma, duty, in spite of discharging all his duties in this world, being free from the fruit of sinful and virtuous actions, attains self-realization or supreme devotion, parabhakti. It means that Jnanaga, the discipline of action, makes a striver qualified for Jnanaga, the discipline of knowledge, or Bhaktiyoga, the discipline of devotion, and also independently leads him to salvation. In other words, it can be said that Karmaga is a means for Jnanaga or Bhaktiyoga and is also an end, viz., it can lead to self-realization or supreme devotion. Link in the 2nd verse of this chapter, the Lord declared the discipline of action to be better than the discipline of stumbling blocks to spiritual progress. Gita 2:44. When we feel happy, after seeing a man happy, our desire for pleasure perishes, because we have become happy without enjoying pleasure. Similarly, our desire for prosperity perishes, because we spend money, prosperity, and material, naturally according to our best capability to remove the suffering of a sad person, by being sad with him, as we identify ourselves with him. In such happiness or pity, there is an uncommon relish, which conduces a man to renounce affinity for actions and objects, and then he, the self, realizes his identity with God. Yogyukta the Karmagi, whose mind is pure, who has controlled the body, who has subdued his senses and whose self is the self of all beings, is called Yogyukta, devoted to the path of action. A striver is not naturally inclined towards spiritual discipline, because his aim and his inclination are different. So long as there is importance of the world in the mind, there is struggle between the aim and inclination. Generally, a striver's aim is to realize God, who is imperishable, while his inclination is towards perishable, worldly beings, objects and circumstances. When his aim and inclination are identified, spiritual discipline is automatically practiced, speedily. Here the term Yogyukta, devoted to the path of action, has been used for such a Karmagi, whose aim and inclination have become one, i.e., God realization. In Karmaga, there is no desire in the least for fruit of actions, but there is certainly an aim to be achieved. The fruit and the aim are different. An aim is one, which can be ever achieved by everyone. Thus, one's aim is God realization, and he can be realized without any action and practice. The fruit is perishable, while God is eternal. A Karmagi does not desire the perishable, because this desire is an obstacle to God realization. When a Karmagi's only aim is God realization, he is called Yogyukta, devoted to the path of action. He, who has been called Yogyukta here, has been called Yogariha, one who has attained to yoga. In the 4th verse of the 6th chapter, a Karmagi, in spite of performing actions, is not bound by actions. A sense of mind, for actions, desire for the fruit of actions, and for pleasure, and a sense of doership bind a man to actions. The gist is, That desire to acquire something or the other, leads a man to bondage. As a karmagi has no desire to acquire anything, he is not tainted, bound, i.e., his actions change into an action. A Sankhyogi is not bound by actions, because he thinks that it is the modes which are acting on the modes, Heala 328, while a karmagi is not bound, as he performs actions, for the welfare of others, without any selfish motive. The term API, even, shows that a karmagi remains untainted, not only during the performance of action but also during their non-performance, Gita 4:18. He has no interest in the performance or non-performance of actions, Heala 3:18. He always remains untainted. It means that a Sankhyogi, having renounced his affinity for the insentient, identifies himself with the sentient, while a karmagi identifies his so-called body, mind, senses, objects and actions etc., with the world, i.e., instead of regarding them as of his and for himself, he regards them as the world and for the world. With this attitude of mind, he cannot have any egoistic feeling in providing comfort to others, doing good to them and performing righteous acts for them. Therefore, while performing action, he has no sense of doership, i.e., is not tainted by action. The Lord, while describing Kanaga, in the 47th verse of the 2nd chapter, by the expression means to say that a striver should renounce the sense of mind, the desire for pleasure in the sense of doership, while by the expression Mathe Lezukadakana he exhorts him to renounce the desire for the fruit of action. Appendix: when a karmagi, having renounced affinity for the body, senses and mind, inner sense, realizes his identity with all beings, then in spite of performing actions, the egoistic notion does not persist in him. Being free from egoism, the actions performed by him don't lead to bondage, Gita 18:17. Link: having described the marks of a karmagi, the Lord in the next two verses describes the attitude of a Sankhyogi while undertaking activities with the senses. The Sankhyogi, who knows the truth, believes, even though seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, walking, sleeping, breathing, speaking, emitting, grasping, opening and closing the eyes, that he does nothing. He holds that the senses move among the sense objects. 8-9 comment here: this expression stands for the wise striver following the discipline of knowledge, who has realized the truth, that all actions are performed by prakriti, nature, and he has no affinity for them. He is merely a witness of the activities of senses. A Tattvavat, knower of the truth, is he who thinks that he, the self, is not the doer, is different from the body, senses, mind, intellect and life-breath, which perform the activities. In fact, a man, the self, is a non-doer, but by an error he regards the self as a doer, Gita 3:27. Actually all the cosmic, as well as individual actions are performed by nature. But a man, by identifying himself with the body, regards its action as his action. So long as he has in the least a sense of doership, he is called a striver. But when he realizes that the self is not at all the doer, he is called a great soul, who knows the truth. As a person, having awakened from sleep, has nothing to do with a dream, so has a great soul, having known the truth, no affinity for actions performed by the body and the senses etc. Such a great soul knows the truth that the self is different from the modes of nature by which actions are performed. The self is the base and illuminator of all the objects and actions etc. It pervades everywhere, and does not undergo any change, while objects and actions undergo. The same fact of distinction between the nature, Kshetra, and soul, Kshetrajvaya, has been pointed out by the Lord, in the 16th verse of the 2nd chapter, in the 4th and the 5th verses of the 7th chapter, and in the 2nd, the 19th, the 23rd and the 34th verses of the 13th chapter. Middle. Pasayisful Vance Persai Unmizanalmasanapi. Here, the 5 actions rig, hearing, touching, smelling and eating, pertain to 5 senses, eye, ear, skin, nose and tongue, while walking, grasping, speaking and emitting. These 4 actions relate to the 5 organs of actions: feet, hands, tongue, genital organ and anus. Sleeping is an activity of the mind, breathing of life breath, opening and closing the eyes, of the sub-life breath named krama. Thus, by mentioning the above 13 actions, The Lord has here the description of the 5 organs of action has been included in 4 actions, i.e., within emitting the actions of both the genital organ and the anus have been included. Described all possible actions performed by sense organs of action, mind, life breath and sub-life breath. It means that all actions are performed by the body, senses, mind, intellect and life breath etc., the evolutes of nature, rather than by the self. Secondly, it also denotes that a Sankhyogi can also perform other acts, such as eating or drinking, business, reaching, riding, reading, hearing and thinking etc., and also other acts for maintaining the body according to caste, order of life, nature and circumstances etc. A man considers himself a doer of those acts, which he performs intentionally, i.e., by applying his mind and intellect etc., such as reading, riding, thinking, seeing and eating etc. But there are several other activities, such as breathing, opening and closing the eyes, which are performed unintentionally. Then, why has the Lord mentioned, in this verse, that a man should not regard himself as a doer of these acts? The answer is, that breathing is a natural activity, yet in breath restraint, purfu, yama, etc., breathing becomes an intentional activity. Similarly, eyes can also be opened and shut intentionally. So the Lord has mentioned that a man shall not hold that he is a doer. Secondly, the Lord, by mentioning breathing, opening and closing the eyes, wants to convey that as a man during these activities thinks that he does nothing, so should he consider himself a non-doer, while other activities are performed. All the above-mentioned activities cannot be performed without a base and an illuminator. The Lord mentions these activities in order to draw the attention of the strivers to the self, which in spite of being the base and illuminator of all these activities, does nothing. Indralayan Indriya Vesuvartantaiti, and the question arises, how are actions performed when there is no doership in the self? The Lord answers the question by declaring that actions are performed when senses move among the sense objects, i.e., the self remains the non-doer, untainted. The term Indrayani, senses, includes the sense organs, the organs of action, mind, life breath and sub-life breath etc. There are 5 objects of senses: sound, touch, sight, taste and smell. The senses move among these objects. All the senses and objects of senses are the evolutes of nature. So all the actions are performed by nature. The Lord declares all kinds of actions are done by the modes of nature. Gita 3:27. All actions are performed by nature alone. Gita 13:29. The senses and the sense objects, being the evolutes of modes of nature, are called modes. So it is said, it is the modes which are acting on the modes. Gita 3:28. There is no agent other than the modes. Gita 14:19. It means that when it is said that actions are performed by prakriti, nature, or by modes of nature or by the senses, these 3 amount to one and the same. Nature always undergoes modifications, while the self never undergoes any. It ever remains free from a sense of doership. Nature can never be inactive, while in the self, no action is possible. The self is the illuminator of actions, while actions are subject to illumination. It means that the self was neither a doer in the past, nor is at present, or will be in future. Nature is ever active and all actions are performed by nature, while the self does nothing. But when the self identifies itself with the evolute of nature, and regards the activities of nature as its activities, it becomes a doer. Gita 3:27. As a man, sitting in the compartment of a moving train, does not move himself, but he cannot remain without covering the distance covered by the train, while he is seated in a compartment. Similarly, when a man assumes his affinity for the physical, gross, subtle or causal body, which are the evolutes of active nature, he becomes a doer of actions performed by these. A Sankhyogi never assumes his affinity for the body, senses and mind etc., so he never regards himself as a doer. Gil 5:13. As actions, such as the growth of a boy from childhood to youth, changing of black hair into gray and white, digestion of food and weakening or strengthening of a body automatically take place, so does a Sankhyogi think that all other activities are undertaken naturally and he is not their doer. In the Jihai, a person who regards himself as a doer of actions has been spoken of adversely. The Lord declares, He whose mind is deluded by egoism, thinks that he is the doer. 327. He who looks upon himself as the doer, agent, he of perverted mind and untrained understanding, does not see, truly. 1816. But the Lord praises a person who sees the self as actionless, by declaring, he who sees that all actions are performed by nature, prakriti, alone, and likewise that the self is not the doer, he verily sees. 1329. The Lord uses the term eva, even, in order to convey that a striver should never think that he is a doer. By doing so, his sense of doership comes to an end and his actions change into inaction. The same idea has been conveyed by the Lord, in the 33rd verse of the 3rd chapter, by the term cestate, which means that his actions are nothing more than mere gestures of actions. The second interpretation of the term eva is that even when a man identifies himself with the body and considers himself the doer, he cannot be the doer. It is merely an assumption, which can never come true. The Lord, in the 31st verse of the 13th chapter, declares, the imperishable Supreme Self, though dwelling in the body, neither acts nor is tainted. The soul, residing in nature experiences pleasure and pain. Gita 13:21. In spite of experiencing the modes born of nature, the man, self, ever remains the same. But he gets tainted, because he does not see the self. The self is sentient while the world, including the body, is insentient. So the self experiences pleasure and pain. Why? The reason is that it identifies itself with the body, world, and experiences pleasure and pain. But if it knows its true nature, that it is imperishable, uniform and untainted, while nature in the form of the world, the body and pleasures and pains, is perishable, then it cannot be an experiencer of pleasures and pains, etc. An important fact the Lord, in the 27th verse of the 3rd chapter, declared, he whose mind is deluded by egoism, thinks that he is the doer. Here, in this verse also, the same fact has been pointed out by the Lord through a negative inference, when he declares, the Sankhyogi who knows the truth realizes that he does nothing. Here the term, manyata, think, does not mean to assume but to realize. The self remains a non-doer during the performance and non-performance of actions, equally. So, the great soul who has known the truth, realizes that the self ever remains the same, as a non-doer, either during the performance or non-performance of actions. The self, as the base and illuminator, never undergoes the least modification. The self never lacks anything, but when it identifies itself with nature, it feels a deficiency in it, and so it desires objects, in order to make up. In order to fulfill that desire, it becomes a doer. No action can be performed without nature, because the instruments, such as the senses and the body etc., with which actions are performed, belong to nature. So a doer has to depend on them. As a goldsmith, howsoever an expert he may be, cannot prepare ornaments without instruments, such as an anvil and a hammer etc. In the same way, a doer cannot perform action without instruments. Thus qualifications, ability and instruments, all the three belong to nature, prakriti, but these appear to be in the self, because of affinity for nature. The instruments undergo modifications while the self ever remains the same. Therefore, they have no affinity for the self. A man, the self, thinks that he is a doer by assuming his affinity for nature, otherwise there is no doership in him. As a Brahman ever remains convinced that he is a Brahmana, so does a great soul, who knows the truth, believe that he is not a doer. Appendix: a discriminating jnanogi by performing actions with senses of perception, organs of actions, mind, internal instrument, and life breath first assumes I myself do nothing and afterwards he realizes it. In fact, in the divine existence neither an action is performed nor any activity happens. All actions performed in the gross, subtle and causal bodies actually take place in prakriti, not in the self. Therefore the self has no connection at all with any action. Through ignorance a man, by identifying ego with the self, is deluded ahankara vimahatma. Gita 3:27. The same man, by the use of discrimination, by detaching the self from ego, becomes tatvavit, an enlightened soul, viz., he has no sense of doership. He ever remains established in the divine self. The self, being deluded by egoism by an error, thinks itself a doer and is thus bound by actions and their fruit and paves the way to 84 lakh forms of lives. Now if a man regards himself as detached from egoism and does not consider himself a doer, viz., realizes the self as it is, there is no surprise about his being an enlightened soul, liberated soul. It means that by assuming the unreal as real, unreal appears to be real. Then what is the surprise, if by accepting the real as real, it is seen real? In fact, when a man assumes the self as a doer and an enjoyer, at that time also he is neither a doer nor an iniya or sisanristapai kandyanakirati na lipiate, Gita 13:31. The reason is that the self is merely an ever-existent reality. In that reality there is no ego and ego has no existence. Therefore I am a doer, however firm this assumption may be, but it is certainly an error. An error is wiped out as soon as it is realized that it is an error. This is the rule. A cave may have been dark for hundreds of years, but darkness disappears immediately as soon as there is light. It doesn't need years and months to disappear. Therefore a striver should firmly hold I am not a doer. Then this assumption will no longer remain an assumption, but it will be transformed into realization. In I, this is identification of both sentient and insentient. I is used for matter, identified ego, and also for the sentient, self. For example, I am a doer in it. There is perception of insentient and I am not a doer in it. Being negation of matter, the self is perceived. He, who has an eye on matter, viz., regards ego as the self, is deluded iamkara vimaihatma, and who has an eye on the sentient, the self free from ego, is an enlightened soul. When a striver at present I myself do nothing thus endeavors to realize the self as a non-doer, he faces a serious problem. When he remembers virtuous actions done in the past, he gets pleased that he had done very good actions. When he remembers the forbidden actions done in the past, he becomes sad that he had done such a sinful act and he had committed such a blunder. Thus the impression of the past actions make him happy and sad. In this connection there is a vital point which needs attention. The self is never a doer, neither at present nor in the past nor in the future. Therefore a striver should perceive that as the self is a non-doer at present, so was it in the past. The reason is that the present has become the past. The self is merely an ever-existent entity in which no performance of action is possible. Actions are performed only by an ignorant man whose mind is deluded by egoism. Gita 3:27. A striver feels happy and sad and is worried by remembering the past actions. That is also really because of egoism. At present, being deluded by egoism, viz., by having affinity for egoism, a striver feels happy and sad. If we perceive from the cursory, gross, point of view, as the past has no existence now, so are the actions of the past clearly non-existent. If we perceive from the subtle point of view, we perceive that as in the past, the present was non-existent, so was the past also non-existent. Similarly, as the past is non-existent now, so is the present non-existent now. But the entity, the self, ever exists. It means that the self is totally free from the limits of past, present and future time. The self transcends the limits of time. Therefore the self is never a doer. In that entity, which transcends time and state, condition, imposition of doership and enjoyership by connecting it with a particular time or situation, is ignorance. Therefore the memory of the actions performed in the past, is the memory of the person whose mind is deluded by egoism rather than of an enlightened soul. Nvikafisit krimi means that actions have no existence but the entity exists. Therefore a striver should have an eye on that entity. That entity being divine is knowledge personified, and being immutable is bliss personified. This bliss is integral, quiet and immutable, uniform. Because of the identification of the self with the body, in every action a man thinks that he himself is the doer. As I see, I hear, etc. An action takes place in the body, but a man assumes it in the self. In the self there is no action, the self is free from the performance or non-performance of actions. Gita 3:18. Therefore even when the actions are performed by the body, a man should have an eye on the self and hold, I do nothing at all. Link having described, in the 7th verse, how a karmagi remains untainted by actions, and in the 8th and the 9th verses, how a sankhyogi remains untainted, the Lord, in the next verse, describes how a bhaktiyogi remains untainted by actions. He who performs actions, dedicated to God and abandoning all attachment, is not tainted by sin, just as a lotus leaf is not moistened by water. 10. Comment. A body, senses, mind, intellect and the life breath bestowed by God, belong to him. Therefore, how can a devotee, following the path of devotion, regard actions which are performed by body and senses etc., as his? He holds that all actions are being performed by the Lord for him. He is merely an instrument in his hands. The Lord wants to convey that it is he who performs all actions with his senses. A striver, realizing this fact, should think that he is the doer of all actions. The worldly objects, such as the body etc., are not a person's own. These have been acquired, and these abandon him. So these should be utilized in rendering service to others, as offerings to God. A person cannot keep these as he wishes, neither can he change these, nor carry these with him, when he leaves his body. So, it is not honesty on his part, to regard these as his own. They are the Lord's, and so these should be accepted as his. A karmagi offers all actions and objects to the world, a jnanagi to nature, and a bhaktyagi to God. God is the master of both nature and the world, and so it is better to offer these to him. A man is said to have abandoned attachment when he has not the least attachment or attraction for beings, objects, senses, mind, intellect, life breath and actions, and has no sense of mind or desire for them. Besides ignorance, which has been called the cause of life and death in the scriptures from the standpoint of the spiritual discipline, attachment to the modes is the chief cause of an embodied soul's birth in good and evil bodies. Gita 13:21. Ignorance is based on attachment. Therefore, when attachment is renounced, ignorance also perishes. Desire springs from attachment. Gita 2:62, and is the root of all sins. Gita 3:37. Thus here in this verse, it is mentioned that attachment, which is the root of sins, should be abandoned, otherwise a man will go on committing sins. In its absence, he incurs no sin. A man's affinity for action is not renounced, so long as he derives pleasure by performing it, and remains attached to its fruit. It is rather enhanced. Attachment of a person does not consist in merely desire for fruit of action, but also in being called good by others. So, action should be performed without the least desire for pleasure, comfort or honor etc. If there is desire for getting pleasure, anyhow in the least, then that action is for oneself. A devotee, following the discipline of devotion, while living in the world and performing actions, in order to offer these to God, is not tainted, bound, in the same way, as a lotus leaf living in water is not soiled by water. Desire for the world, and having a disinclination for God, is the root of all sins. Desire springs from attachment. Where there is no attachment, there is no desire, and so sins cannot be committed without attachment. All undertakings are covered by defects, evils, as fire by smoke. Gita 18:48. But he who has renounced hope, desire and attachment, becomes free from all defects. When actions are performed, in order to be offered to God, having abandoned attachment, a striver becomes free from the accumulation of all sins. Gita 9:27-28. Therefore, a bhaktyagi totally becomes free from sins. Here, the term papina, sin, stands for the fruit of past actions, in the form middle dot of virtue or vice, which cause the soul to be born in good and evil bodies. A bhaktyagi is never tainted, bound, by that fruit, in the form of virtue and vice. The same fact has been pointed out by the Lord, in the 28th verse of the 9th chapter, when he declares, "Thus shalt thou be freed from the bonds of actions, yielding good and evil fruits." Appendix: here God endowed with attributes has been called Brahma, the Absolute. It means that God is all. He is endowed with attributes and is also attributeless. He is endowed with form and is also formless. In his entirety all characteristics are included. Gita 7:29-30. In Srimad-Bhagavata also Brahma, attributeless, formless, Paramatma, with attributes and formless, and Bhagavan, endowed with attributes and form. All the three have been mentioned as one. It means that within Saguna, God endowed with attributes, Brahma, Paramatma and Bhagavan, all the three are included, but within Nirguna, attributeless, only Brahma is included, because in Nirguna there is negation of attributes. Therefore Nirguna is limited while Saguna is entire. Vaisnavas, the devotees of Lord Vishnu, called the function of the Lord endowed with attributes and form Brahmotsava, function of the Absolute. Arjuna has also addressed Lord Krishna as Brahma Parabrahma Paradama Pavitra Paramarlavan, Gita 10:12. In the Gita, Brahma has been mentioned by 3 names, or Tat and Sat, 1723. Because of the relationship between the name and the nami, person having the name, he is proved to be Saguna, endowed with attributes. Link in the next verse, the Lord explains how karmajas perform actions. The yogis, having discarded attachment, perform actions merely with the body, mind, intellect and senses, for the purification of the self. Comment: Yojana. Here the term yojana stands for karmajas. The yogis, who perform actions, offering these to God, are called bhaktiyajas, while those, who perform these in order to render service to the world, without any selfish motive, are called karmajas. A karmagi, middle. While performing actions, regards his so-called body, senses and mind etc., as the world's, and not his own, as they have their identity with the world. In fact, the body, senses, mind and intellect etc., which a common man regards as his own, are not his, because these have been acquired from the world and they will abandon him. So, it is an error on his part to assume that these are his. All of these have their identity with the world. If we give a serious thought to it, we come to realize that the body etc. are not ours, in any way. They belong either to God or to nature, prakriti, or to the world. Thus, it is an error to regard these as ours, and to have a sense of mindness with them. The term kevale, merely, has been used here to root out this sense of mindness with them. Here, the term kevale, being plural, is an adjective for senses. But, it does not mean that sense of mindness for mere senses is to be renounced. It means that sense of mindness for the body, mind, intellect and the entire world is to be abandoned, for which a person has attachment. When a girl is married into a family, her relationship with her in-laws is automatically established. In the same way, when a man is attached to any worldly object, he gets attached to the entire world. So the term kevale should be taken as abandonment of sense of mindness for the body, senses, mind and intellect. In fact, a doer, agent, himself, should become detached. By doing so, his attachment for body, senses, mind and intellect etc., is totally abandoned. The reason is that the body, senses and mind etc. are quite different from the self. A sense of mindness with these is merely assumed, it is not natural. In the discipline of action, renunciation of the desire for fruit is important. Gita 5:12. Common people perform actions in order to reap their fruit, but a karmagi performs these to root out attachment to the fruit. But a person who regards the body, senses, mind, intellect and life breath etc. as his own, cannot renounce the desire for fruit, as he assumes that when the body etc. are his, he should also reap the fruit of actions performed by him. Therefore, if a striver wants to wipe out the desire for fruit, it is indispensable for him that he should not regard the body etc. as his own. When it rains, it is useful for crops and people etc., but rain is not aware of the fact that it is falling and doing good to the world. Similarly, senses should not have a feeling of doership when they render service to others. But, if some service is rendered by the senses, body, mind or intellect, and gives us a sensation of elation, it means that the service has not been performed with a feeling of detachment. On the contrary, it is a sign of attachment and possession. Vide the explanation in the 10th verse, for the expression sangranti activa. If a person has no desire for the fruit but regards the body etc. as his own, the fruit of action becomes his motive, which has been forbidden by the Lord by the declaration, "Let not the fruit of action be thy motive." Gita 2147. Generally, it is thought that a heart is purified when sins, accumulated sin, volatility of mind and ignorance, are removed. But, in fact, purification of the heart consists in total renunciation of attachment, or a sense of mind, with the body, senses, mind and intellect. The body, etc., never regards us as theirs, but we assume these as ours. This assumption of mindness is impurity. Saint Tulasi Dasa in the Ramakaya Manasa declares, "Let the filth of the sense of mind be burnt. So, heart gets purified when there is total renunciation of affinity, of an egoistic notion and sense of mine, etc. The term kevale denotes the aim of renunciation of the sense of mine, with the body, senses, mind and intellect, while the expression atmasadhe denotes total renunciation of a sense of mine. When the striver's aim is to renounce the sense of mine, yet this sense prevails in its subtle form. When this sense of mine in its subtle form also perishes totally, it is known as a state of purification of the inner sense. The sense of mine also resides in egoism. When this sense of mine is totally renounced, egoism also becomes free from this sense of mine, and the self, heart, is totally purified. Karmakarvantya karmagi performs actions to totally renounce a sense of mine, in its subtle form, from the body, senses, mind and intellect, etc. So long as a person has a desire for the fruit of action, and so long as he assumes that the body, senses and mind, etc., are his own, he cannot be liberated from the bondage of actions. Therefore, a karmagi performs actions for the welfare of others, without having a desire for the fruit of actions, and without regarding the objects of action, body, senses, mind and intellect, etc., as his own. For a sage, who wishes to attain to yoga, action, for the welfare of others, is said to be the means. Gita 6:3. The more he continues working for the welfare of others, the more his attachment and sense of mine are renounced, and thus his self, heart, is purified. Appendix: the heart is not purified by trying to purify it, because it is not purified so long as we regard it as ours, since the assumption of mineness with it is the main impurity. Therefore in the Ramakirota Manasa it has been declared, let the filth of mineness be burnt. Manasa, Uttara 117a. The Lord here also, by using the term kevale, has mentioned not to have the sense of mineness with the inner sense. Purification of the inner sense consists in total renunciation of the sense of mineness with the body, senses, mind and intellect. Therefore karmajasaktane, detached manner, in order to wipe out the sense of mineness totally from the inner sense, they don't perform any action for their own self. The reason is that so long as the sense of mind persists, mere actions are performed, but karmaga is not practiced. When actions are not performed for one's own self, then kanaga proceeds towards self-realization. A karmagi first acts aiming at freedom from the sense of mineness, then his aim is achieved. Link: the Lord, in the next verse, explains the merit or glory of karmaga by positive, as well as negative inference. The karmagi attains everlasting peace, God realization, by abandoning attachment to the fruit of action, whereas he who acts with a selfish motive, being attached to the fruit of actions through desire, acquires bondage. Comment: yukta. The meaning of this term is taken according to the context. In the 8th verse of this chapter, the term yukta has been used for the Sankhyaga, who does not regard himself as a doer of actions, while here it has been used for the karmagi, who has renounced the fruit of action. All strivers, whose aim is to attain equanimity, are yukta or yogi. In the present verse, it has been used for a karmagi, who having a determinate intellect, has renounced worldly desires. This expression means the renunciation of desire for fruit and also renunciation of attachment, because in fact it is not the fruit of actions which is renounced, it is desire for the fruit of actions which is renounced. That fruit may be reaped, either immediately or in the future. When a striver regards nothing as his, does nothing for him, desires nothing for him, it means that he has renounced the desire for the fruit of actions. A man's prarabdha, fate, is determined by the hoard of his past actions, and according to that he is born in good and evil wombs. In human life, actions which are performed produce impressions that are added to the stock. But, when he renounces attachment to the fruit of actions, such actions cannot bear fruit, like roasted seed, and these change into inaction. Gita 4:20. Because of the effect of actions, which are performed without desire for the fruit of actions, the latent impressions of the old actions, accumulated of past actions, are reduced to nothing. Gita 4:23. Thus, the cause of his rebirth melts away. Fruit of actions is of 4 kinds. 1. Visible: the fruit of present actions, which is visible immediately, as satisfying one's hunger after having a meal, is a visible fruit. 2. unforeseen fruit, which will be reaped in future, in the form of favorable or unfavorable circumstances etc., here or hereafter. This fruit is unforeseen. At present the action goes to the accumulated stock of actions. 3. Received as fruit of past actions of the body, with its caste, order of life, wealth, property and favorable or unfavorable circumstances, which have been bestowed upon us, as a result of past deeds. 4. Unreceived, fruits yet to be reaped in future favorable and unfavorable circumstances, which we have to receive in future as ordained by destiny, prarabdha karma. Out of the 4 kinds of fruit of action, the visible and the unforeseen depend on present actions, while the received and unreceived ones depend on prarabdha karma. When a striver does not desire the visible fruit, nor does he feel displeased or pleased, having received it, and does not expect the unforeseen one, nor is he attached to the received fruits, nor feels happy or sad having received it, and does not desire the unreceived one, then it is said that he has renounced the fruit of action. Common people perform actions with a desire for the fruit of actions, and during performance, they go on thinking of that desire. As a businessman makes transactions for profit and goes on thinking about profit and feels happy with profit, and sad with loss, similarly, all people perform actions, having desire for favorable gains, such as wife, son, riches, honor and praise etc. But a karmagi performs actions by renouncing desire for fruit. Now a question arises, why should a man perform actions if he has no desire? The answer is that none can ever remain still for even a moment without performing action. Gita 3:5. Even if it is accepted that a man can abandon actions to a great degree, even then, so long as he is attached to the world, he will think of sense objects, and that is also an action. The thought of sense objects finally leads him to ruin. Gita 2:60-63. Therefore, so long as a striver does not renounce attachment totally, he cannot be liberated from the bondage of action. The old attachment is wiped out by performance of action, while the new one does not arise when actions are performed for the welfare of others, and without any selfish motive. In fact, it is ignorance if actions are performed with desire for fruit, because firstly actions and their fruits are perishable, and secondly, these will bear fruit, according to fate whether desired or not. A man cannot have increase or decrease in fruit by mere desire. When actions are performed for the welfare of others, without desire for fruit, affinity for these is renounced. A karmagi does not perform actions without an aim, like an insane man, but he performs these having a high aim of God realization. To realize his aim, he works for the welfare of others. As he is not attached to the body, he performs actions promptly and scrupulously, without such evils as indolence and heedlessness. A vital fact: if actions, which are performed to acquire the worldly materials, are performed for the welfare of the world, with the aim of God realization, and without any selfish motive, these actions can lead a man to God realization. In the 20th verse of the 3rd chapter, it has been declared, Janaka and others attain perfection, verily by action only, while in the 3rd verse of the 6th chapter, it has been stated, action is said to be the means with the sage who wishes to attain to yoga. These fads reveal that God can be realized by actions. Parvati and Manasatanipa etc. also realized God through performance of actions, in the form of penance. It is also mentioned in the scriptures that he can be realized through chanting, meditation, good company, study of scriptures and cognition etc. On the contrary, it is also mentioned that he cannot be realized through actions, such as penance etc. Gita 2:53. How to reconcile the two? The answer is that in fact God is not attained through any action. He is also not a fruit of action. God pervades everywhere, everything, incident, circumstance and person etc., all the time. He is ever attainable to everyone, and everyone abides in him, only no one can ever be separate from him. But a man being attached to perishable body, senses, mind, intellect and objects etc., which are revolutes of insentient nature, has a disinclination for God, who is his. Spiritual discipline is to be practiced in order to wipe out this attachment or affinity. Through the performance of penance etc., When this affinity for the insentient is renounced, God, who is ever attainable, is attained. This affinity can be very easily renounced when actions are performed for the welfare of the world, without any selfish motive. The sentient and eternal Lord cannot be bought for all the wealth of the world. All the worldly objects stand nowhere when all of them are compared to the imperishable Lord. Moreover, a thing which is bought for a particular amount is cheaper than that amount. Thus, if God is realized by performing actions, it means that he is cheaper than actions. Here is a vital point, which calls for attention. Generally, strivers during spiritual practice depend on and have affinity for the body, senses, mind, intellect, etc., with which they perform that spiritual activity. So long as they have affinity for these, i.e., the insentient, they cannot realize God. As soon as this affinity is renounced, God is realized. God realization is not possible through matter, rather it is by snapping our connection with it. The body, senses, mind and intellect, etc., belong to the same class to which the world belongs. So these should be utilized in rendering service to the world. This is karmaga. A striver should not accept his affinity for these, nor should he depend on them, as he cannot get rid of the unreal by having affinity for the unreal. Actions are performed without any selfish motive, in order to renounce affinity for the unreal. When this affinity is totally renounced, disinclination for God perishes, and ever-attained God is realized. It has stood the test of experience that when a person has neither desire for the worldly objects, nor is attached to them, he attains peace. Even during sound sleep, when the world is forgotten, a man experiences peace. Similarly, one attains peace when he completes any assignment or task, such as the marriage of his daughter. If he renounces his affinity, desire and attachment during wakefulness, he will attain peace. But if he enjoys this peace, he cannot attain everlasting peace or the supreme peace, because this peace is not an end, but a means to attain the supreme peace, called yoga. Gita 6:3. So long as a striver remains attached to peace, which he attains by renouncing his affinity for the world, he is bound. Gita 14:6, and he cannot attain the supreme, uniform and eternal peace. The term ayukta has been used for a person who works with a selfish motive. Such a person, because of his several desires, being attached to fruit of actions, has to follow the cycle of birth and death. A person cannot acquire things, etc., merely by having a desire. Secondly, he cannot possess these forever, even if he has acquired them. So, it is futile to have a desire for acquiring objects, etc. Saint Tulasi Dasa in the Vinyapatrika declares, all worldly objects will abandon you. In the end it is better if you abandon them right now. 198. It does not mean that their physical abandonment, renouncement, leads to salvation or God realization. Had it been so, all persons who left their bodies at the time of death would have attained salvation. But it is not so. In fact, it is desire, a sense of mind and attachment to these which are to be renounced, because these lead to bondage, i.e., end to the cycle. This everlasting, supreme peace is God realization. It has been called eternal peace, 931, the supreme peace, 439 1862, and peace, 529, 2170 71, in the Gita, of birth and death. When actions are performed for the welfare of others, their flow is towards others, and any assumed affinity for them is easily renounced. Appendix. In fact, practice of the spiritual discipline in order to attain salvation or God realization is also attachment to the fruit of action. A man has formed the habit to do a piece of work with the desire for its fruit. Therefore it is said that one should practice spiritual discipline for salvation or God realization. In fact, spiritual practice is needed in order to wipe out attachment to the world, otherwise salvation is axiomatic. The Lord is ever attained. God realization is not the fruit of an action. Therefore the yearning for the performance of action in order to attain God is also the desire for fruit. A striver should not think that this spiritual practice will bear this fruit. Desiring the fruit is an attachment to the fruit which does not allow the spiritual discipline to be followed scrupulously. Therefore, instead of thinking of the fruit, a striver should practice spiritual discipline promptly, which will naturally lead him to divine perfection. If a striver goes on thinking for the fruit, he will not attain divine perfection. We shall attain the transcendental state or the desireless state, and then we shall be happy in this way. The desire to derive happiness or pleasure is also the desire for fruit which hinders a striver from becoming transcendental and desireless. Link. Having dwelt upon Karmayoga, the Lord now comments at length upon Sankhyoga. The embodied soul, having controlled the senses, and having renounced the performance of all actions by discrimination, in the abode of 9 gates, neither acting nor causing others to act, he rests happily in the self. Comment. When a man is attached to the senses, mind and intellect etc., these control him, but when he renounces attachment to them, they remain under his control. A Sankhyogi being so, is called Vasi. So long as a man has the least attachment for the evolutes of nature, body, senses etc., he has to remain under the control of nature. Gita 3:5. Prakrti, nature, ever remains active. Therefore, a man cannot refrain himself from performing actions, so long as he is attached to nature. But a Sankhyogi, who is not at all attached to the gross, subtle and causal bodies, the evolutes of nature, do not become the performer of actions. Though such a Sankhyogi has not the least attachment for the body, yet, he is called the embodied one, as he seems so to the common people. Navad pure 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, a mouth. These 7, located in the upper part of the body, while the genital organ and the anus located in the lower part of the trunk. These 9 openings have been called the 9 gates. This body has been called the city of 9 gates, in order to clarify the point that as the abode and those who inhabit the abode are different, so are body and the soul. As a person living in the city does not regard activities undertaken in the city as his own, so does a Sankhyogi not regard activities of the body as his own. Sarvakarmani Rananasasanyasya. Here, the expression Sarvakarmani stands for the 13 types of actions performed with the body, senses, mind, intellect and life breath, as described in the 8th and 9th verses of this chapter. Here the expression Manasasanyasya means renouncing the doership in actions through discrimination. If the meaning of the expression is taken as renouncing mental actions only, it will not be proper, because according to the Gita, renouncing mental action mentally is also an activity of the mind. Gita 18:15. So, there is doership of this mental activity. Therefore the renouncement of actions mentally means renouncing the affinity of doership through discrimination. A Sankhyogi does not regard himself as the doer, he leaves the doership in the body. A Sankhyogi becomes neither a doer himself, nor does he make others doers. As he is not in the least attached to the body, senses, mind and intellect etc., he cannot regard actions performed by them as his. In the 8th verse of this chapter also the Lord has pointed out the same fact, when he declares, "The man who knows the truth, thinks that he does nothing at all." In the 31st verse of the 13th chapter, also he declares, "The Supreme Self dwelling in the body, does not act." Here a doubt arises, that it is true that the Self does not perform actions, but it can inspire others to perform actions. The clarification is, that as with the rise of the sun, people are engaged in different activities, such as farming, study and business etc., even though the sun does not cause them to perform either prescribed or prohibited actions. Had the sun itself caused them to act, then it would have been responsible for their virtues and sins. Similarly, Prakriti derives its existence and power from God, but he never causes it to act. This fact has been described by the Lord by the expression Nakarian. So does nature, having received power from God or self, function, but the self does not inspire anyone to act. All human beings dwell naturally in the self, but they believe that they rest in the body, senses, mind, intellect and life breath. So they cannot realize the reality that they rest in the self. But a Sankhyogi realizes that he rests in the self, which is perfect and uniform, and this belief involves no labor. So, here the word asked, rests, has been used, while in the 24th verse of the 14th chapter, the term svasta, dwells or rests in the self, has been used. The self is the origin of all origins and it needs no base. This state of resting in the self has also been conveyed, in the 20th verse, by the expression, such a knower of God, rests in God. Appendix: the idea to do an action is an obstacle to self-realization. The feeling of performing an action causes the sense of doership, and the sense of doership leads to individuality. Performance of action is in prakriti. In the self there is actionlessness. Therefore performance of action connects us with prakriti, and by non-performance of action we get established in the self. I have to do nothing. This notion is also within the area of the performance of action. Therefore a striver should have nothing to do with the performance of an action or its non-performance. Gita 3:18. The self is free from performance of an action or its non-performance, viz. It is a transcendental entity. Vasti: by attachment to the modes of prakriti a man becomes a vasa, viz. helpless. Gita 3:5. This helplessness is wiped out by jnanaga and a man becomes vasi, viz. his life becomes independent and transcendental. Link. Middle. In the preceding verse, the Lord declared, the embodied soul neither acts, nor does it cause others to act. Now, the question arises, whether God causes others to act? The Lord answers the question in the next verse. Neither the sense of doership nor the nature of actions does the Lord determine for the mankind, nor does he link actions with their fruits. But it is the personal nature alone that impacts. Comment: the term prabhu has been used here because the universe is created by the Lord, who is endowed with attributes. He is omnipotent and he controls the entire universe. Though he conducts the activities of the entire universe, yet he remains a non-doer. Gita 4:13. All actions are performed by the modes of nature, but out of ignorance, a man identifies himself with nature and becomes a doer of actions, which are done by nature. In fact, Gita 3:27. God has not made man the doer. If he had made him the doer, the Lord, in the 8th verse of this chapter, would not have said the man, who is united with the divine, and knows the truth, thinks, I do nothing at all. It means that this sense of doership is self-made, and so it can be renounced by the man who has inculcated it. The Lord does not decree whether a person will have to perform a particular virtuous or evil deed. Had it been so decreed by him, the prescribed and prohibited actions mentioned by scriptures, preceptors, etc., would have been of no avail, and a man would not have had to bear the fruit of his actions. The expression nakarmani proves that a man is independent in the performance of actions. A man has to reap the fruit of actions which he performs. Actions, being insentient, cannot decide upon their result. So, it is ordained by God. Gita 7:22. The Lord awards the fruit of actions, but he does not bring about union with fruit of actions. It is the man who brings about this union. He, out of ignorance, having become a doer and having been attached to fruit of actions, has to feel happy and sad. If he himself does not get attached to fruit of actions, he can be free from it. The term sannyusinam, renouncers, in the 12th verse of the 18th chapter, has been used for such persons who are not attached to the fruit of actions. They have not to reap the fruits of their actions, here or hereafter. If God had connected actions with their fruit, a man would have never been liberated from the fruit of actions. In the 47th verse of the 2nd chapter, the Lord declares, let the fruit of action not be thy motive. It means that it depends upon a man whether he feels happy or sad, and whether the fruit of action is his motive or not. If the Lord had ordained the fruit of action, then a man would have never become even-minded in pleasure and pain, and he would have never performed actions having abandoned attachment, or the fruit of actions, which has been emphasized by the Lord time and again in the Gita, Vidi 4120, 512, 1424, etc. Question: in the scriptures, it is mentioned that the Lord causes those whom he wants to send to the higher worlds to perform virtuous actions, while he causes those whom he wants to send to the lower worlds to perform evil actions. Thus the declaration, neither agency nor actions does the Lord create nor does he connect actions with their fruits, seems contrary to the ordinance of the scriptures. Answer: in fact, the scriptures do not mean that the Lord sends them to the higher or lower worlds by causing them to perform virtuous or evil actions, but these mean that the Lord purifies them by enabling them to reap the fruit of their past actions by creating circumstances so that they may attain God or his love. Being overpowered by desire, man performs good, virtuous, and bad, evil, actions, Gita 3:37, which lead him to the higher worlds, heaven etc. If the scriptures are interpreted in the way that the Lord causes people to perform virtuous or evil actions, so that they may go to higher or lower worlds, then man will become dependent. In performing actions, prescription and prohibition by the scriptures and saints, and instruction of the preceptors, will prove to be futile. So this interpretation does not seem to be justified. Svabhastu pravartate, it is because of his nature that man becomes a doer, performs actions and connects actions with their fruit. Man himself is responsible to form this nature. So long as there are attachment and aversion in nature, it is not purified, and as long as nature is not purified, a man is overpowered by nature. The Lord mentions here the same fact, which he has already stated in the 33rd verse of the 3rd chapter, when he declared, beings follow their nature. So long as a man acts according to his nature, he will become a doer, will perform actions and will link actions with their fruit. Thus, he will remain dependent, and this dependence is self-created. If man renounces doership, actions and association of actions, with fruit which he has made himself, he can realize that he is ever untainted, uncontaminated. Appendix: the sense of doership, action and attachment to the fruit of action. It is not God's creation, but it is the man's, embodied soul's, own creation. Therefore the man is responsible for its renunciation also. In fact, renunciation of affinity for the world is natural, but because of the perception of naturalness and unnaturalness, affinity for the world is seen natural. This individual nature is not natural and untainted, but it is one's own creation. In lower worlds, hells etc., a man has desires by making a misuse of the freedom which has been bestowed upon him so that he may attain salvation. Linkwidi: the Lord neither creates agency, doership, nor does he force anyone to perform action, or bring about union of the actions and their fruit. How can he reap the fruit of action? The Lord answers the question in the next verse. The au-pervading Lord acquires neither sin nor the virtue of any, as knowledge is enveloped by ignorance. Therefore, beings get deluded. 15. Comment: the Lord, who has been termed Prabhu in the preceding verse, has been called Vibulai here. A man can reap the fruit of action in two ways: by performing actions himself, or by causing others to perform actions. But the Lord neither performs actions, nor does he cause others to perform these. So, he has not to reap their fruit. The sun provides light to the entire universe, and man commits sins and also perform virtuous actions, but the sun has nothing to do with those sinful or virtuous actions. Similarly, nature and the entire universe receive power from God, and with that power people perform virtuous and sinful actions. But those actions performed by the people have not the least connection with God. The Lord has given freedom to man, whether he connects actions with their fruits, or offers actions and their fruit to God. He who, by misusing the freedom given by the Lord, becomes a doer and reaps the fruits of actions, is bound. The Lord does not accept these actions and their fruit as his. But he, who by making right use of freedom, offers his actions and their fruit to God, is liberated, and the Lord accepts such actions and their fruits. As, in the 25th verse of the 7th chapter, by the term sarvasya, all, and, in the 26th verse of the same chapter, by the term kaskana, anyone, the Lord has talked about common people. So has he described by the term ascetic common people, who regard themselves as doers and enjoyers of fruits, rather than about devotees. As far as devotees are concerned, the Lord accepts a leaf, a flower, a fruit, or a little water, which is offered to him, with devotion. Gita 9:26-27. The knowledge of the self is self-evident to all the people, but this knowledge is enveloped in ignorance. It is because of this ignorance that beings are deluded. He who thinks I am the doer is deluded. Gita 3:27. A man can wipe out this delusion by discrimination, which has been bestowed upon him by God. Therefore, in the 8th verse of this chapter, it has been said that a Silkyajas will ever think, I do nothing at all, while, in the 13th verse it has been said that he should mentally renounce all actions by discrimination. All objects, such as a body etc., are constantly undergoing change, while the self never experiences any change. When a man identifies the self with kaleidoscopic objects, it means that he is swayed by ignorance. But, when he realizes that the self is different from the kaleidoscopic worldly materials, his ignorance is wiped out and the knowledge of the self is illumined automatically. The reason is that knowledge of the self is veiled when one assumes affinity with the evolutes of nature. The term ajnana does not mean total absence of knowledge, but it means imperfect knowledge, as there cannot be total absence of knowledge. Knowledge of the senses and intellect is also imperfect. When a person attaches importance to this imperfect knowledge, and is influenced by it, he does not keep an eye on real knowledge. This is known as enveloping of the knowledge by ignorance. The knowledge of intellect is more extensive than that of senses, or that of the mind. The knowledge of intellect illumines the knowledge of the mind and senses, but it cannot illumine nature, whose evolute it is. When it cannot even illumine nature, how can it illumine the sentient, which transcends nature? Thus, the knowledge of intellect is imperfect. The Lord, by using the term jantava, has condemned human beings, by saying that those persons who do not attach importance to discrimination are in fact animals, because without discrimination there is no difference between the two. A human being is a human being not merely by virtue of human form, but because of his sense of discrimination. As far as sensual pleasures are concerned, even animals enjoy these. But the aim of human life is not to hanker after them. Instead, it is to realize the self or God, who is free from pleasure or pain. Those who know what ought to be done and what ought not to be done deserve to be called strivers. He who believes that he is a doer, and who having the motive of fruit of action, feels happy or sad, such a man is said to be deluded out of ignoramus. We are forced to do virtuous and evil actions. How can we get rid of them? To be happy and to be sad is the fruit of our actions. How can we rise above these? To have such conviction is delusion. Man, self, is a non-doer, and is also free from pleasures and pain. It is out of ignorance that he becomes a doer and feels happy or sad, by bringing about union with fruit of actions. The term tina stands for this delusion, ignorance. The ignorant, out of delusion, feel happy and sad. The same fact has been food, sleep, fear and sex are common between men and animals. Men are superior to animals because of their sense of discrimination. Without discrimination they are just like animals, Kanakyaniti 1717 pointed out, by the expression, by that, beings are deluded. Appendix says the dark has no power to cover the sun, so has ignorance no power to cover knowledge. The unnatural has been assumed as natural. This is ignorance by which a man is deluded. Therefore this is merely a notion, not a fact that knowledge is covered by ignorance. If a man so desires, then by attaching importance to his discrimination, he can destroy this delusion, ignorance. Gita 5:16. In fact, knowledge is not covered but intellect is covered. But to a man, knowledge appears to be covered. Therefore here the term avarta has been used. The same fact has been mentioned in the 39th verse of the 3rd chapter by the expression, Gita 3:39. Ignorance is non-existent or a negation. It has no existence. A non-existent thing cannot veil the knowledge. Therefore opposite knowledge, viz., perception of naturalness and unnaturalness, is ignorance. If the vision of unnaturalness is discarded, naturalness automatically reveals itself. Then a man will realize his identity with omnipresent God. It is because of individuality that sins and virtues attach to us. Therefore, having realized identity with the omnipresent God, viz., by the destruction of individuality, sins and virtues no more attach to us. Because of ignorance, viz., opposite knowledge, natural intellect in the unnatural, a man becomes Jantu, animal. Similarly the embodied soul, because of its affinity for matter, non-self, becomes Jagat, world, matter. Gita 7:13. We have regarded the Lord who is ever identified with us, the self, as separate, and we have assumed the body which is different from us as identified with us. This is ignorance. Yoga Darsana 2:5, link. Middle. In the preceding verse, the Lord declared, beings are deluded because knowledge is enveloped by ignorance. The Lord explains the glory of knowledge in the next verse, which is illumined when ignorance is destroyed through discrimination. But to those whose ignorance is destroyed by knowledge, discrimination, Such knowledge lights up the Supreme Self, like the sun. Comment: the term "to," but, has been used to show that, in this verse there is description of something different, from the preceding verse. Whatever was called Jnana in the preceding verse, has been called here Tatijnanam, that ignorance. Ignorance consists in identifying the self with the body, while knowledge comprises in regarding these as two separate entities. If we have an egoistic notion and a sense of mind with the body and the world, this is ignorance. The self ever remains the same, while a sense of I and the sense of mine change. In the past, we were children and toys were very dear to us, but now we are young or old and regard our wives, sons and riches etc. as ours. Thus, we see that the sense oft, and of mine, are undergoing change while the self ever remains the same. That is knowledge, or discrimination. The perception of the eternal in the transitory, of the pure in the impure, of pleasure and pain and of the self in the non-self is ignorance. Thus a striver should realize this reality through discrimination, and renounce the sense of I and that of mine. This is called destruction of ignorance, by knowledge. A person identifies the uniform self, with the kaleidoscopic world etc., because he does not attach importance to discrimination. A striver, who having aroused this discrimination, renounces the sense of I and that of mine with the perishable world, his discrimination lights up the Supreme Self, i.e., he realizes God, who is truth consciousness bliss consolidated. When discrimination is fully aroused, a striver has no affinity at all for the kaleidoscopic world. Then he realizes the self, and then the Supreme Self is illumined, i.e., the self realizes its identity with the Supreme Self. The word param, here as well as, in the 59th verse of the 2nd chapter and the 34th verse of the 13th chapter, has been used for the Supreme Self or God. The term prakasayati signifies that, as in the dark, objects are not seen, but these are noticed when the sun rises. So is the Supreme Self, who is ever attained, is not realized because of ignorance. As soon as ignorance is destroyed, the Supreme Self is realized. Appendix: ignorance is destroyed only by discrimination, not by effort. Gita 15:11. The reason is that destruction of ignorance is not possible by the performance of action and by doing labor. By doing labor, affinity for the body persists because without having connection with the body, no labor is done. Secondly, by making effort to wipe out ignorance, ignorance is strengthened, because an effort is made to wipe it out only when we accept its existence. The opposite notion, ignorance, off-naturalness and unnaturalness, is self-made. By attaching importance to discrimination, that ignorance is removed. Link: the Lord in the next verse explains how to reach the state from which there is no return. Those whose mind and intellect are wholly absorbed in God, who remain constantly identified with Him, and having finally become one with Him, their sins having been wiped out by wisdom, they reach a state from which there is no return. Comment: God can be realized by two means. First, He, the reality, can be realized by renouncing the unreal through discrimination, and secondly, by thirst for the real. The unreal can be attained through actions, rather than through thirst. How God can be realized through thirst is explained in this verse. A striver, through intellect, should have a conviction that the Lord pervades everywhere. He existed before the world was created, exists now, and will also exist if the world is being destroyed. This is known as absorbing of the intellect in Him. Here the term atarna stands for the mind. When a striver resolves that only the Lord pervades everywhere, his mind automatically thinks of Him only. When the mind and the intellect of a striver are absorbed in God, he realizes that he is naturally established in Him. But, so long as the mind and the intellect do not get absorbed in God, i.e., a striver does not think and resolve of his all-pervasive nature, he cannot realize that he is naturally established in Him. Such strivers, instead of having a separate entity, become one with God. Their identity is merged in God, and thus they become an embodiment of God. Unless the striver and the spiritual practice become one, the discipline is not continuous. But, when the striver loses his egoistic notions, his means merges in the end, because both of these are identical. Jnana through discrimination, wisdom or knowledge, between the real and the unreal, a striver gets rid of the unreal. It is because of his affinity for the unreal, that he commits sins, and is bound. When his affinity for the unreal is totally renounced, his sins and virtues are totally wiped out. Attachment to the unreal is the cause of rebirth. The Lord declares, attachment to the modes is the cause of soul's birth, in good and evil wombs. Gita 13:21. When our attachment for the unreal is wiped out, there is no question of our return to the mortal world. A thing, which is finite, moves from one place to another, but one, which is all-pervasive, wherefrom is it to come and whither is it to go? God pervades all space, time, objects, circumstances, equally. He never moves, and so is the case with great souls. As they have identified themselves with him, they also do not move. The scriptures declare a God-realized soul, here and now, merges in God. His vital force does not migrate. Brihadaranyaka 4:4-6. Regarding his so-called body, it is said that he is not reborn. In fact, the term gakanti, go, stands for acquiring the knowledge of the self, which immediately leads to realization of God who is ever realized. Appendix. When the notion of naturalness and unnaturalness is wiped out, then no other independent existence besides God persists, and a striver becomes the embodiment of God, which is really axiomatic. Therefore there is no question of his return to the mortal world, worldly bondage. ME 1412. Link. The Lord in the next verse describes the attitude, vision, of God-realized souls. Sages equate a learned and humble brahmana, a cow, an elephant, or even a dog, or a lowly outcast, as these have a vision of God in all of them. Comment here. Two adjectives, learned and humble, have been used for brahmana, in order to show his perfection, as generally a learned person is not humble, and he becomes proud of his learning. Dealings of a sage with a learned brahmana, a pariah, a cow, an elephant, and a dog would be different. Equal dealings are neither proper nor possible. The scriptures also support this view. A learned and humble brahmana, rather than a pariah, is adored. Milk is drunk of a cow, rather than of a bitch, while an elephant rather than a dog can be used for riding. When the Lord says that sages see them with an equal eye, he means to say that they behold the Lord, pervading everywhere. Therefore, they do not see with an unequal eye. Here, a doubt may arise: how can their dealings be different, if they have an equal eye? The explanation is, that we see all the parts of our body, forehead, feet, hands and anus etc., with an equal eye and think of their welfare, yet our dealings with these are different. When anyone is touched with our feet we feel sorry and beg his pardon, but we do not do so if he is touched with our hand. We show reverence for others, by bowing our head and folding hands, rather than feet. A hand has to be washed, if it touches anus, but it is not washed, if it touches a hand. Showing the forefinger and the thumb to someone, have different meanings, which are well known to all. In this way, a man has different dealings with different parts of the body, but he loves them equally. He is not indifferent to any afflicted limb. He, through the lightness of the self, sees equality everywhere, be it pleasure or pain. Gita 6:32. In this way, the wise also have different dealings with different beings according to the difference in their food, qualities, conduct and caste etc., and it is proper also. They behold the Lord, pervading everywhere, and so they love all beings and think of their welfare equally, without having any evil propensities, such as attachment, aversion, pride and partiality. They have an automatic inclination to remove the sufferings of other beings and to console and comfort them, in the same way as a person tries to remove the pain of any limb of his body. So, it is said that they see everyone with an equal eye. The Lord has mentioned of this equality of vision or even-mindedness several times in the ME as he, who is equal-minded, excels. 6:9, he sees the same everywhere. 6:29, he, through the lightness of the self, sees equality everywhere. 6:32, even-minded everywhere, he, who sees the Supreme Lord abiding equally in all beings, never perishing when they perish, verily sees. 13:27, and he sees the same Lord equally dwelling everywhere. 13:28. Sri Sankaracharya declares a man should be non-dual in feelings, rather than in dealings. Tatvapateza. An important fact pertaining to equanimity. Nowadays, people talk a lot about equanimity, but it must be understood in the right perspective. Equanimity is not child's play but an embodiment of God. The Lord declares, those whose minds get rooted in equanimity, overcome the world, birth and death, and realize the Absolute, God. Gita 5:19. This state of equanimity is attained when others' pleasure and pain become a striver's own pleasure and pain. The Lord declares, 0 Arjuna, he who through the likeness of the self sees equality, equanimity, everywhere, be it pleasure or pain, is considered a perfect yogi. Gita 6:32. A striver attains equanimity when he is engaged in removing the suffering of others, in the same way as he gets engaged promptly in removing his own suffering. Explaining the marks of a saint, Tulasi Dasa declares saints feel happy and sad in the happiness and sadness of others. Manasa 7:38-1. So long as a man desires pleasure, he can't attain equanimity, in spite of his best efforts. But, when he has a keen desire to provide comfort to others, to do good to them, and he thinks of their salvation, he becomes equanimous. A striver should begin such activity with his family. He should try his best to remove the suffering of his parents, wife, sons and other near and dear ones, even if he has himself to suffer. By doing so, he will attain peace. Similarly, he should try to remove the suffering of others. By doing so he will be thrilled with joy. We should serve those to whom we are not attached, or we should renounce our attachment for those whom we serve. The result will be the same. Saint Tulasi Dasa in the Manasa declares, Laxmana serves Lord Rama and Sita with the same zeal as that with which an ignorant man serves his body. 142-1. It is not wise to serve one's own body, because even an animal does so. A mother monkey loves its young gone so much that it does not leave the young gone, even when the latter dies. But, when someone gives it any eatable, it eats itself, without giving it to its young gone. Even if the young gone tries to eat, the mother scares the young one away. As long as attachment is there, equanimity is out of the question. We should serve others in a disinterested manner. If anyone goes astray, we should guide him in a pleasant way to follow the right path. By doing so, we shall feel peace and happiness. If we do not guide him, we cannot experience peace. Let anyone try this and see. Similarly, if we invite a thirsty person to have a drink of cold water, it gives us satisfaction and peace of mind. This kind of happiness or peace leads us to salvation, while the desire to seek pleasure leads us to degradation. In the same way, when religious discourses are arranged, we should politely request people to take comfortable seats, so that they may listen to the discourse properly, instead of commanding them in an authoritative tone. By doing so, we shall derive satisfaction and peace. But, if we command them in an authoritative tone, it will reveal our pride, which will prick others, and we shall not be able to attain peace. By such behavior, we can never attain equanimity. Those who are engrossed in the welfare of all beings attain the Lord. Gita 1214, because he is a disinterested friend of all beings. Gita 5:29. It is he who rears all beings, whether they are believers or non-believers. Water quenches the thirst of both the staunch believer and non-believer. The sun provides light to both, air helps everyone to breathe, and the earth provides room to everyone, without any distinction, whether they believe in God or not. Thus, everybody has an equal share in the things created by God. Equanimity or equality does not mean that food should be eaten and marriages should be arranged without taking into consideration caste, creed or color, etc. Equality in such dealings leads to degradation. It is the god of death who has equal dealings with all, because all the beings, whether they are saints or householders, animals or gods, have to die. Animals also have equality of dealings. A dog enters a Brahmana's kitchen with unclean feet, in the same way as it enters the kitchen of a sweeper, because it does not distinguish between a Brahmana and a sweeper. But the same behavior on the part of a man cannot be ignored. Equanimity consists in removing the suffering of others and in doing good to them. This equanimity purifies him and his heart. But if one does not observe purity in food, etc., his heart gets impure, which leads to disquietude. Superficial equality is against the ordinance of the scriptures and the decorum of society, and it causes conflict in society. The scriptures do not support the view that the Brahmanas, priest class, are high by caste, while the Sudras, labor class, are low. The Brahmanas through preaching, the Kshatriyas, the warrior class, through protection, heroism, the Vaisyas, the trading class, through trade, and the Sudras, the labor class, through physical labor, should serve the members of all castes. But, it does not mean that members of other castes should not do physical labor while performing their duty. All of them should labor equally during the performance of their duty. Everyone should render service to others and cooperate with them with all the resources he possesses. In the past, people followed the Varna, caste, system and asrama, order of life, system and led a happy and peaceful life. But today the Varnasrama system is being replaced by factions and groups. In villages people cannot even get water because the owners of the wells do not allow those people, who support the candidates of the rival parties, to draw water from their wells. Among the members of the same family also, there are feuds because they support different parties. How miserable is the condition! If we want to attain equanimity, we should try to remove the sufferings of others whether they belong to our caste, order of life, religion or sect etc., or not, and should also do good to them. They may be the devotees of Lord Rama or Lord Krishna or Lord Shiva, or they may be Muslims or Christians etc. We should equally think of their welfare. We should never be partial to the people of our own caste or creed or group etc., nor should we feel happy and sad when our own group or creed gain victory or suffer defeat over a rival group or creed etc. We should help them and satisfy their needs, to the best of our capacity and resources, without having feelings of envy, jealousy, hatred and pride etc., as upliftment is possible through righteous feelings, virtues and good conduct. Moreover, we should have the feelings that all beings should be happy, and free from disease and none should ever suffer, in the least. Having such feelings, we should do good to others, that is equanimity. Appendix: a Brahmana, a pariah, a cow, an elephant and a dog, the bodies of all these are changing every moment and are going into non-existence, but the reality ever abiding in them never changes, it ever remains the same. The wise perceive that reality only. As an ant extracts grains of sugar mixed with sand, in the same way the discerning eye of the wise perceives the real entity pervading the unreal world. It means that whether there is a Brahmana or a pariah, a cow or a dog, an elephant or an ant, and all these heterogeneous beings, the wise have an equal eye. In spite of inequality in their dealings, they have never an unequal eye. Link: in the next verse the Lord explains the glory of equanimity. Even here, the whole world is conquered by those whose minds are vested in equanimity. As God is flawless and equal, therefore, they become merged in God. Braham. Comment: when a person realizes that he is established in God or self, and when he renounces attachment, aversion, desire and unevenness of mind etc., his mind and intellect naturally get established in equanimity. Though outwardly there is no obvious difference between the dealings of a great soul and a common man, yet inwardly there is a lot of difference. The mind of a great soul remains equanimous, flawless and quiet, while that of a common man, uneven, defective and disquiet. In the morning, when the sun rises, it is not seen in the east if it is hidden behind high mountains, in that direction, but its light can be seen, on the top of a high mountain in the west. It shows that the sun has risen, even if it is not visible, in the east. Similarly, those whose minds and intellects remain untainted by honor and dishonor, praise and blame, pleasure and pain, etc., and are free from attachment, aversion, joy and sorrow, are naturally established in the self. The reason is that for a person without being established in the self, it is impossible to maintain evenness of mind and intellect. Here the plural has been used in the term te, by those, by the Lord, to explain that all men can realize God and can conquer the entire world. The expression aiva means that even here, during a lifetime, in this world, they can conquer the world, i.e., can be liberated from this world. The body, senses, mind, intellect, beings, objects, incidents and circumstances etc., are all different from the self. He who depends on them is dependent. He who attaches importance to them and desires them remains dependent, i.e., is defeated. But when he renounces attachment to them and sincerely gives up desire for them, it means that he has overcome them. Till slavery to desire persists, he is a vanquished one. Only a defeated person wants to win over and subdue others. In fact, no one can defeat others without subduing himself. For example, If a king or a scholar wants to defeat others, he will have to resort to his army, capability, learning, wisdom, etc. A man becomes dependent as soon as his desire is born. This dependence remains, whether desire is satisfied or not. When the desire is not satisfied, a person remains dependent for want of the object of his desire. But, when that desire is satisfied, he depends upon the object he has acquired, though he does not realize this dependence because his intellect is veiled by ignorance. He feels himself to be independent. A wise man becomes totally independent because he has no desire at all, and such a man is victorious, though he has no desire to overcome others. He needs nothing in the world, while the world needs him. Such an equanimous great soul, who has overcome the world, is not tempted by much mundane pleasure and is not shaken, even by the heaviest sorrow. Gita 6:22. He has not the least desire for any beings, objects and circumstances, etc. Though he knows of desirable and undesirable circumstances, and makes effort to be free from the undesirable ones, yet they have no effect on his mind. Nirdo samhisamim Brahma. All flaws and heterogeneity are found in a man, because of his affinity for nature. But God is flawless, equanimous and unattached because he has no affinity for nature. God is flawless and equanimous. Therefore, great souls, whose minds are flawless and equanimous, are established in God. When a man is attached to the kaleidoscopic and unreal world, all flaws and heterogeneity are born. As great souls do not attach any importance to the unreal, they remain flawless and equal, and so they remain established in God. As, where there is smoke there must be a fire, because without fire, smoke is not possible, so are those whose minds are established in equality, established in God, because without being established in God, full equanimity, equality, is not possible. When a man himself gets established in God, his mind is also established in equanimity. It is only when they have attained the state of equanimity that great souls are said to have attained God realization or equanimity. This equanimity has been called yoga in the Gita 2:48. According to the Gita, this attainment of equanimity is regarded as perfection of human life. The topic of Jnana, the discipline of knowledge, was started in the 13th verse. The term Jantava, beings or animals, used in the plural number in the 15th verse, continued up to this 19th verse. The Lord, by using the plural number, means to explain that all those people who are deluded can attain God realization. But, in the present verse the term Brahmani has been used in the singular, which indicates that all people attain the same God. Every person, whether he is a Brahmana, member of the priest class, or a pariah, attains the same Lord, who was attained by great sages such as Sanaka, etc. Appendix. Here the term mana should be interpreted as intellect, because it is not the mind which gets established in equanimity, but it is intellect which gets established. Mind is concentrated in meditation. This is the topic of steadfast intellect. Steadfastness of the mind persists only in meditation, not while engaged in dealings, but steadfastness of intellect persists constantly. It is not the steadfastness of mind but the steadfastness of intellect which leads to salvation. Steadfastness of mind brings about siddhis, mysterious accomplishments. Therefore steadfastness of the mind is not of so much value as is the steadfastness of intellect. The Lord in the 2nd chapter also has glorified a man of steadfast wisdom, intellect. In the next verse also the Lord has mentioned that an undiluted person with a firm intellect becomes one with Brahma, God. By error a striver may not think himself to be an enlightened soul. Therefore this mark has been mentioned, that if there is no equanimity in intellect, one should understand that he has not attained self-realization. This is merely his misconception. The mark of equanimity in intellect is freedom from attachment and aversion, pleasure and pain, etc. Having realized the self, equanimity ever persists in intellect. Intellect never deviates or stirs from this equanimity. Those whose intellect is established in equanimity become free from attachment and aversion. Their equanimous intellect naturally remains firm in the fact that all is God. When there is no other entity besides God, then who should have aversion, and towards whom? When only that one ever-existent entity is realized, then no desire persists, and no disquietude remains. Link. The Lord, in the next verse, explains how to get established in God, the Absolute, And what are the marks of such a sage, who gets established in him? He, who neither rejoices on obtaining what is pleasant, nor grieves on receiving what is unpleasant, and who is a firm understanding and unbewildered, such a knower of God vests in God. Comment: to get agreeable beings, objects, incidents and circumstances, appealing thought, body, senses, mind, principles, caste, creed and scriptures, is called acquisition of priya, agreeable, and what is contrary to it is apriya, disagreeable. When a striver obtains pleasant, desirable, beings, objects, and circumstances etc., according to his desire, he should not feel happy. Similarly, when he meets with unpleasant ones, he should not be sad. He knows the desirable and the undesirable ones, but he is neither attached to the desirable nor has an aversion for the undesirable. Mere knowledge of the agreeable and disagreeable is not a flaw, if one remains free from joy or grief. The mind knows the desirable, pleasant, and the undesirable, unpleasant, while the doer becomes happy and sad. Though all actions are performed by the modes of nature, yet he whose mind is deluded by egoism thinks, I am the doer, feels happy and sad. But he who knows the true character of the self, soul, and the modes of nature, understands that it is the modes which are acting on the modes. Gita 3:28. So he knows that he is not the doer, and thus there is no question for him, the self, to be happy or sad. The self can be known by the self, without the help of the instruments, such as the body, senses, mind and intellect etc. The knowledge, which is acquired with mind and intellect etc., is imperfect, as it is neither permanent nor certain, doubtless. But the knowledge of the self by the self is permanent, uniform and certain. A great soul, who has realized this knowledge of the self by the self, has such a balanced and firm mind, that there remains neither any doubt nor option nor contrary feelings in it. So, he is called sthira-buddhi, one with firm intellect or understanding. Commonly, deluded people do not behold the omnipresent Lord, ever pervading everywhere. They believe that the world, which is really transitory and unreal, is real. But the undeluded are those who are completely free from such belief. Brahmavid God cannot be realized by a person who does not identify himself with him. But when he identifies himself with him, without having any separate entity, he realizes him. In God realization, the liberated soul, the means and God, all the three, become one. There remains no trio, only realization is left. In fact, who has realized God? This cannot be explained. The reason is, that such a liberated soul becomes one with God, Brahma, and he has not the least pride of his achievement, that he has realized God. Brahmanishtuta. In fact, all beings are essentially and constantly established in Brahma, God, but by an error they assume that they are established in body, senses, mind and intellect etc. So they cannot realize the truth, that they are established in him. But a great soul, in all circumstances, realizes that he is established in him, naturally and constantly. An object may be established in another object, but establishment in God is distinct from it. When the great soul identifies himself with God, only God remains. He completely loses his separate entity. So long as he thinks that he is established in him, it means that he has not fully identified himself with him, and he still has finiteness. Appendix: in sound sleep and in a swoon a man's affinity for the body is renounced involuntarily, viz. Due to ignorance the mind merges in ignorance. Therefore in these states a man does not feel pleasant and unpleasant and also bodily pain etc. But a liberated exalted soul renounces his affinity for the body discriminately. Therefore he knows the pleasant and the unpleasant and also bodily pain etc. But he does not feel rejoiced and agitated, happy and sad in them. His dependence on the body, senses, mind and intellect is wiped out. Knowing Brahma and getting established in him both are one and the same. Link: a person is naturally established in God. The Lord, in the next verse, describes the means of attaining that state. When a person is no longer attached to external sense objects, he finds happiness in the self. Having completely merged himself with Brahma, God, he enjoys eternal bliss. Comment: he who, instead of being attached to the body, senses, mind, intellect, life breath etc., as well as to objects of senses, such as sound and touch etc., is attached only to God, is known as unattached to external contacts. A striver whose attachment has not been totally wiped out, but whose aim has been to wipe it out, should also be included among those strivers who have renounced attachment, as they quickly get rid of it because of their firm resolve. This detachment is necessary in order to attain the state mentioned in the preceding verse, in which a striver neither rejoices on obtaining what is pleasant, nor grieves on getting what is unpleasant. So long as a man is attached to sense objects etc., internally or externally, he cannot realize the self. All these objects are transitory and constantly undergo change, but because of attachment to them a man has not an eye on their kaleidoscopic nature and derives pleasure out of them. But in fact they cannot provide pleasure. It is renunciation of affinity for them which provides pleasures. Therefore, a man feels pleasure in sound sleep when he forgets his affinity for sense objects. A man has a wrong notion that he cannot live without external contacts, but in fact, he cannot live with constant external contacts. To forget all external contacts he sleeps. Thus he regains freshness, vitality and health, which he can never get in the wakeful state. Therefore, he considers sleep very essential. Energy is gained through dissociation with objects. When a man goes to bed, he means to renounce his affinity for external objects, as also to work after waking from the sleep. As he attaches more importance to work, he does not pay attention to the renunciation of his affinity for objects. He sleeps and awakes having affinity for objects. It is very surprising that if a person who was our relative dies, our affinity for him continues. The reason is that the assumed affinity can be wiped out only when the person who has assumed it renounces it. As soon as he renounces it, he attains salvation, which is natural. The affinity with external objects is unreal, while our affinity with God is real. A man assumes his affinity with external objects in order to derive pleasure out of them, but it results in sufferings. Gita 5:22. By realizing this fact, attachment to external objects is destroyed. When attachment to the external objects is wiped out, a striver FMTS sattvic happiness. Happiness derived out of the affinity for the external objects is rajas, of the mode of passion. A person goes on enjoying this rajasa, of the mode of passion, happiness, so long as he does not gain sattvika, of the mode of goodness, happiness. When he ceases attachment to the rajasa happiness he gains sattvika happiness. Sabrahmagyuktitma. As soon as attachment for the world is lost, a striver identifies himself with Brahma, God. As with the disappearance of darkness, light is revealed, so when attachment to the world is erased, the striver is identified with Brahma. Both happen simultaneously. Yet disappearance of darkness is prior to illumination of light. It is deemed so. Similar is the case with effacement of attachment and establishment in God. In the first verse of the 13th chapter, it is described that the knower of the field, the self, is different from the field, body, while in the second verse it is said that the self has its identity with the Supreme Self. Similarly, in this verse by the expression Bayas Parsasvasaktatma, with the self unattached to external contact, it is explained that the self is different from the body and the world. This expression Brahmagyuktatma elucidates the identity of the self with God. Having become detached from pleasure and having found sattvika happiness, a striver may have a subtle egoistic notion, by thinking I am happy, I am wise, I am flawless, I have no duty to perform and so on. In order to get rid of this subtle egoistic notion, it is necessary that a striver should identify himself with God totally, otherwise he cannot remain totally free from the sense of individuality. Sukhamakshyamanud. So long as a striver goes in enjoying sattvika pleasure, he has egoism, attachment, in subtle form. But, when he ceases to enjoy the sattvika happiness, his egoism perishes totally and he realizes God, who is sentient, uniform and imperishable. This is known as eternal bliss. This is also called infinite bliss. 621 6128, absolute bliss, 14,127, and so on. Having attained this eternal bliss, there is natural attraction for God, and this attraction is known as supreme devotion. Gita 18:54. This devotion ever increases, i.e., the Lord, seems to be revealed in new forms, to such a devotee. In this connection, there is a point which needs attention. If a striver thinks that his devotion was imperfect in the past, but now it has attained perfection, it means that the striver has not attained perfection, as he is an aspirant still. But, if in spite of perceiving novelty in the Lord, he feels that his devotion was supreme in the past also, it means that he has attained perfection. Middle. In the preceding verse, the Lord declared, when a person is not attached to external contacts, he attains eternal bliss. In the next verse, he explains how to renounce attachment for sense objects. The pleasures that are born of attachment with objects are only sources of pain. These have a beginning and an end. 0 Son of Kunti, Arjuna, no wise man finds happiness in them. 22 Common ye hi samsparsaja pleasure is derived from the contact of senses, with their objects sound, touch, color, taste and smell. A man also derives pleasure out of honor, praise, beings, objects, circumstances etc. Man is not free in acquiring sense objects. If somebody eulogizes the doctrines we respect, we feel happy. That is also a sort of enjoyment. It means to derive pleasure through beings, objects, circumstances and states by body, senses and mind is known as bhoga, enjoyment. Not only the forbidden pleasure, but also those which are sanctioned by the scriptures, must also be renounced, because these are obstacles to God realization. Pleasure can be derived only by having affinity for insentient matter, while it is a must to renounce affinity for the insentient matter, to attain God realization. All the pleasures have a beginning and an end. These are impermanent, kaleidoscopic, Gita 2:14, and insentient, while the self is permanent, unchanging and sentient. The sense objects never identify with the self, therefore, the self cannot gain happiness from pleasure. The self is a fragment of God, Gita 15:7, therefore, it can attain eternal bliss from God, Gita 5:21, alone. As soon as a person realizes that these pleasures have a beginning and an end, are transitory and fleeting, the effect of pleasure and pain is lessened for him. Therefore, the expression adivanta is a panacea to root out the effect of pleasure. All the pleasures born of contacts are only sources of pain. Pleasure is born of pain and ends in pain. A man feels happy having acquired a thing, in the same proportion as its lacking was causing pain to him, and again feels sad having lost it. A libertine cannot escape pains or sorrows, because sensual pleasures can be enjoyed by having affinity for the insentient matter, and this affinity for the insentient is the cause of great suffering, in the form of birth and death. In the Patayajaloga Darsana, it is stated, a wise man does not indulge in pleasures, because these result in 3 kinds of pains. These pains are called parinamadukha, pain as a result, tipadukha, affliction, and samskridukha. Moreover, contradictions in the modes of nature also result in pain. Sensual pleasures, which appear like nectar at first, are like poison in the end, Gita 18:38, because in enjoying these, energy and objects are lost. So the result is pain. This is parinimadukha. When a person beholds others enjoying those pleasures which he cannot enjoy, because he does not possess those objects, or when he is afraid to lose them, or when he is incapable of enjoying these in spite of his attachment for them, he is filled with grief, in spite of the fact that the objects are available to him. This is tipadukha. He remembers the lost pleasures. This is pain, in the form of latent impressions. This is called samskridukha. A person wants to enjoy pleasure because of his inclination to them, but his discrimination checks him from enjoying them. Similarly, while listening to divine discourses, because of the mode of ignorance, he feels sleepy. He wants to derive pleasure from sleep. But because of the mode of goodness, he thinks that he should avail himself of such golden opportunities, which are very rare. Thus there is a contradiction or say tussle in the modes of nature, and this internal fight is very painful for strivers. In the enjoyment of pleasure, a person is dependent because these can be enjoyed according to one's fate. Will is independent in God realization, as this human body has been bestowed upon him, only to attain him. Pleasure cannot be enjoyed equally, even by 2 persons, while God can be realized by everyone, even in this Kali age, as he was realized in the Satya age, by great sages. Pleasures cannot be enjoyed forever, by all persons, while God can be realized forever, by everybody. It means that there is a difference in acquiring pleasure, i.e., all people cannot acquire these. But there is no difference, as far as renunciation of pleasures is concerned. All can renounce pleasure. The word eva means that pleasure is, doubtlessly and certainly, a source of pain. There seems to be happiness in them, but in reality, there is none in the least. Not a Saramate Buddha, a wise man, unlike a common man, does not delight in pleasure, because he regards these as sources of pain. He does not become a slave to them. A wise man knows that all the sorrow, suffering, sin and hell etc. depend on the desire for pleasure. Therefore, he who attaches importance to this knowledge is wise. He who knows that pleasures are sources of pain, yet desire them and delight in them, does not deserve to be called wise. As a wise man neither desire nor takes delight in them. Appendix: the pleasure derived from contact with objects